The following 3 hours are new stories that I've never narrated before. Hope you guys enjoy it. It's all about nature, camping, hiking, that sort of stuff. If you have a few minutes, and if you wouldn't mind, if you could just hit that subscribe button, hit that thumbs up. And you know what? I got shirts on Teespring. You could join a membership and all that other happy stuff. Very Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to everybody. And I hope you continue to tune in. Thanks, everyone. Camp is a style that prefers outrageous and exaggerated substance, a palate for bad taste. A camp is a temporary lodge typically dwelled in by travelers or adventurers. And Camp is, well, the story you're about to read, both campy in its style and substance, and named ever so fittingly after the nickname given to Camp Neil Hazy, the Camp. Camp Neil Hazy got its unfortunately fortunate nickname from the nearby silver waters of Lake Neil Hazy, and the legend harbored beneath. You see, at Lake Neil Hazy, there's something of an urban myth that served as the lakes and surrounding campgrounds' claim to fame. The Neil Hazy River Monkey. Now, if you've never heard of the River Monkey, you'd be forgiven, because essentially it doesn't exist, at least to some. To others, the River Monkey is a deeply endearing icon of the lakeside forests of North America, a less respected Bigfoot or Nessie in virtually every way. Yet, it too has its share of disciples, and most of them, rather conveniently, live within 50 miles of the Neil Hazy, which, mind you, is not a river, but a lake. And so the whole River Monkey name in and of itself doesn't make a lick of sense. And neither does the legend at large. Now you'd think that an oversized, river-dwelling primate would be the last thing on people's minds. But you'd be wrong. You see, people eat this kind of thing up, especially in the middle of nowhere where the only thing to do is hunt down a fictionalized monkey man. Nah, of course he's real, the hick spat, depositing the rest of his loogie aside his boot and grinding it into the dirt. No one ain't seen him 'cause he's hidden. Why is he hiding? Ella asked cynically, jotting an X adjacent to the two others, winning her 7th game of tic-tac-toe against herself, her only worthy opponent. She did have some notes on the page, but her mind had clocked out hours ago. Was this really worth it? Driving all the way out to Tumfuck 2, wasting who knows how much precious petroleum just to interview some backwoods, probably inbred, tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy nut, all in the name of a cheap buck? She didn't have that answer. She never did, but she was there, wasn't she? Smack dab in the middle of nowhere. And this wasn't the first time. What was it, last month again? Bat Boy? Yeah, that was a good one. How about the woman that was having sex with her husband's ghost? Or the guy who claimed he was molested by a Yeti? There were some weird folks that lived out in the middle of nowhere. And of course, by the middle of nowhere, she meant the podunks. Pocketed little cesspools squirming with the kookiest weirdos on God's green earth. And if you could believe that, some of those weirdos made the other weirdos look like beacons of normalcy by sheer comparison, which only proved just how wacky some people could get when cut off from the outside world. Thankfully, most of the fringe types were harmless folks, but every now and again, there'd be one that'd stir the pot, tip the scale from conspiracy to collusion, like those crackpots that cut crop circles, the ones that gave them all a bad rap. And if they didn't, well then she most certainly could. Well now, think about it, the man said, interrupting her inner monologue abruptly. Dribble still dribbled on his scruffy chin. If he's caught, Well, the government will probably cut him up and experiment and shit on him. Ella nodded, biting her tongue. Anything else? The man stood, obtusely quiet, until he sprang alert. Oh, yeah, he said, rushing back into his home, and not 5 seconds later did he emerge with a folded-up piece of paper, handing it over to the Ella. I drew this as soon as I saw him. Well, police told me it wasn't evidence, but I swear he looked exactly like that. It was the most crudely drawn picture of a monkey she had ever seen, so much so that it looked like a 4th grader would have laughed at it. She couldn't help but crack a grin, one that only widened when she noticed the same faded print on the man's wife-beater. He must have noticed her eyesight as he, too, looked down at the scribbling on the shirt and smiled a toothy grin. Will you like it? He asked. His eyes were wide. Old LeoDuhVinci liked it so much they started selling it on t-shirts. I make royalties now. Where do they sell it? Ella asked. The gift shop. I got some extras if you want one. What size is you? The man asked, looking down at the woman's blouse and embarrassingly twitching back to eye contact with a nervous smile. I'm good, thanks. That'll be all. Ella nodded with a click of her tongue and pen. All of the podunks she had traversed in her travels, this one was the podunkiest. Ella in her brand new Lincoln Continental, now in need of a fresh wash, stuck out like a sore thumb amidst the vast array of dilapidated houses and shacks that aligned the dirt road leading to her undesirable destination, Camp LeoDuhVinci, which was a place that should have only been visited by middle schoolers with an undeveloped brain. And yet, the good old downtown tattletale insisted that Ella Lancaster drive her sweet ass 1,000 miles into the boonies to milk yet another tragedy, all in the name of exploitation. It was a young boy this time, 13-year-old Cody Hodgson, and unlike the guy that got fondled by the abominable snowman, this kid wasn't able to book an interview, because he went missing. She could see the cover now. Young camper snatched by river monkey. Not the kind of thing the parents would probably want to read, but according to the charts, 20 or so odd million subscribers did. The approaching fork in the road picked at the question festering on her mind. Continue on or go home. The fast lane back the way she came was right there after all, but if she chose it, she could kiss that overdue promotion goodbye. But maybe she didn't want it. It was the sleaziest tabloid in town after all, not exactly a career she saw herself in. But it paid the bills. And so, with an internal release, Ella let her foot off the brake and traveled onward. It was the dog days of summer, for sure, but not even the dog dared to stick its snout into the sun. Instead, it merely licked itself under the shade of an overgrown oak, wrapped in the same metal chain that drooped from its neck. Not far away, beside an old school bus whose yellow had faded a sickly white, was a mailbox, perhaps fashioned in that same shade of oak, which looked as if it had been hit a dozen or so times by a stray pickup. And though it couldn't sing like a dog, the worn and rusted hinges on that box attested to the history and reputation of Camp LeoDuhVinci, which had seen its fair share of eviction slips over the years. Yet, here it stood anyway. The only thing not standing, in fact, was the operator of the fine establishment, a gentleman by the name of Stanley Reese, who at one time was something of a lively, happy-go-lucky son of a gun, now diminished to something of a neurotic, rocking back and forth on the porch swing that hung against the camp office window, and murmuring nonsensicals himself. Then, in an instant, a brand spanking new Lincoln Continental pulled through the brush and broke to a stop atop the dusty gravel. A sight for sore eyes for Stanley, considering all the cops in and out of the place over the last 4 days. But when he noticed the fancy pants blouse and smug chiseled woman step from the elegant upholstery, something told him his worry wasn't for nothing. He descended the porch and skipped across the hot dirt on the balls of his bare and calloused feet, and when he reached Ella, he smiled. Not genuinely, of course, but wide enough to pass off his falsetto tone as genuine. "Good afternoon, ma'am. What brings you around these parts?" He smelled like smoke, somewhere in between a cigarette and a campfire. He probably hadn't showered in days, made apparent by the caked-on layers of sweat that clung to his face, and the unkempt ball of hair on his head that looked like a sleeping cat. A dead sleeping cat. "Will I take it you're Stanley Reese?" The man nodded clumsily. "I'm Ella. I'm with the Downtown Tattletale. I have some questions about Cody Hodgson." The man ran his fingers through the dead cat on his head, sighing heavily. "Now, let me level with you, ma'am," the man pleaded, that falsetto tone dropping like a bead of sweat, which, rest assured, were dropping too. "I could tell you all about the differences between a clove hitch and a half a hitch. Hell, I could show you how to kayak, shoot an arrow, and start a bonfire before it'd be time to eat lunch. But now listen to me. I don't know how to answer all these legal questions. Hell, I didn't even finish high school." Ella didn't bother with her notebook this time. She nodded out of what little genuine pity she had for the well-meaning man, and rephrased her prompt. "Well, all I want to know is what happened, from your point of view." "Well, I didn't see much of anything. I was getting supper ready, and some of the campers swarmed me, told me about Cody. Immediately, I thought the worst. Hell, I didn't know if the kid could swim, but the cops never found anybody in the lake. He's just gone." Ella nodded, biting her lip before asking, "What campers?" "Well, friends of his, I take it. Perhaps a dozen or so boys. They all felt terrible. See, they told me that they told Cody that if he went into the outhouse, a spider would crawl up his butthole and lay eggs in his stomach." Kids, right? Anyways, the kid refused to even look at the damn latrine, and so he decided to go pop a squat out into the woods. And after about 4 to 5 minutes or so, when supper was almost ready, one of our counselors asked his cabin mates where Cody was, and they didn't know. Then they all came to me. Ella logged the story in the back of her mind, like chicken scratch on her soggy brain. She could tell that Stanley couldn't stand another question about the boy, so she opted to ask what was, in her eyes, a seemingly harmless one. "So, do you think it was the monkey?" Stanley swallowed back any words he might have been rash to say. Clearly, he had something on his mind, but his shifty eyes suggested that he might have not been at the liberty to say it. After 2 more glances east and westward, confirming that no one else was around, he moved in closer on Ella, who could smell the sweat that had seeped under his pits. "Now that monkey," he said, "is the reason this camp is still standing. People love that shit. Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Ella, pardon my French. So much so that we got a damn gift shop about him. So real, not real, don't matter to me. He sells. And I didn't even go to business school, ma'am." "So you're saying it's a hoax?" "Now all I'm saying is that we're about to get a lot more business." River Monkey for president, and I survived the River Monkey and all I got was his lousy t-shirt, were just some of the designs in the gift shop, not to mention the Hicks eyewitness drawing, available in 6 different colors. There were plushies, coffee mugs, and even a bobblehead pen of the thing. But what struck her as most intriguing was a wall of masks, plastic pieces of garbage covered in fake hair that felt like peach fuzz glued to a to-go box. And aside from the fact that they were almost out of stock and selling for $25, she couldn't get over the fact that they might have been a clue in this whole thing. With her disposable, she snapped a shot. "I take it you won't be buying nothing," a moist voice said. Ella turned sharply around with a gasp and noticed a young woman, no older than 23, standing behind the counter and chewing on a wad of gum. The pigtails from her hair bounced with every smack from her lips, and Ella wondered why she didn't notice her there before. But the real question was why she was there at all. "I'm sorry," Ella said with a relieving breath. "I didn't see you there. I thought you were..." "The river monkey. I get that a lot." The girl reached into her jaw and removed the wad, sticking it beneath the countertop, along a dozen or so other flavors. "And so you believe in that thing?" Ella asked. The girl shrugged. "I was going to say Stanley, but that too." Ella nodded with a half smile. "Who are..." "Well, I'm Stanley's girlfriend," the girl said before Ella had time to finish. "I keep watch over the shop and bookkeeping." "Well, you're that lady from the papers, huh?" she asked. She was far too young to be Stanley's girlfriend, but it seemed like that wasn't going to stop them. Not out here. "The downtown tattletale, yes," Ella said, stepping closer to the register counter. "Yeah, well, I've read it before. You make us country folk look like hillbillies," she said, a sour look on her face. "We're not all crazy, you know." Ella nodded softly. "I know, I'm sorry." It was a relief saying that word for what might have been the first time. "Oh, now it's all right," the girl said, noticing the embarrassment on Ella's face. "The name's Angie," she said as she extended her hand. "Ella." The girl's hand was softer than she expected, and yet her grip was firmer. "Those masks sell well?" Ella asked. Angie looked over her shoulder and nodded. "Oh, yeah. Most popular thing we sell. We see the campers like to scare each other, especially around the fire, telling ghost stories and whatnot, and then popping out in masks. It's pretty funny." "Well, I bet," Ella said with a smile. "You ever think their pranks go too far?" Angie shrugged at that statement. "I don't know," she said. "One time we had a kid fall into the river with his pants down. Well, I guess his friends might have taken that one a little too far." Ella nodded in understanding, stepping even closer to the countertop. Another step, and she would have been touching it. "Reason I ask," she said, "is 'cause Stanley said this kid had bullies. You think they'd ever do anything to, hurt him?" Angie chewed on the question for a second, popping a quarter into the gumball machine on the counter and twisting. A bright red sphere barely dropped into her hand before she jammed it into her mouth and crunched. The rack of masks stared back at her from across the wooden shack, and she put two and two together. "Are you saying that they framed the river monkey?" Ella shrugged. "Are you?" Angie couldn't answer that one. "Well, I think it'd be hard to mistake a giant monkey for a 12-year-old kid in a Halloween mask," Angie said, duly noting the rack of masks. It was clear that the implication was a bit steep, even for Ella. "Well, how about the employees?" she said. "Could any of them have done it?" "The counselors?" Angie asked. Her voice was raised. Surely any finger pointed at one of them was 4 pointed back at herself. Or was it 3? "If you're asking if they'd kidnap a kid, well, you'd best talk to Stan, and not even he would know," she said, a shot of hot air escaping her nostrils as she chortled. "What, you think we run background checks out here?" Ella knew they didn't. It could have been anyone. And anyone came in the form of a crudely torn piece of paper wedged ever so conveniently beneath the driver's side windshield wiper of her Lincoln. She had just finished photographing the place as the sun began setting, and if she was going to reach the hotel before midnight, she needed to get going. The one-lane country road stretched on for miles, and it wasn't like she could take the freeway. Angie and Stanley bid their farewell with a parting gift, or perhaps just a bribe to keep her article positive. A t-shirt with the doodle that was all too familiar to her by this point. She smiled and thanked them and turned for the car. And that's when she saw it. The paper. It looked as if it had been ripped from a spiral notebook, the paper moist and grungy and smeared with a nearly illegible semblance of letters. And yet, somehow, she could faintly read the words, "I know," followed by an address, a tip. It would have been foolish for any woman, especially one as young and ambitious as Ella, to drive out to some lonesome house in the middle of nowhere, and in the middle of the night, and waltz right through the front door. God knows what might have been waiting for her. But then again, Ella was young, and she was ambitious. The drive was only about 5 miles or so, yet the curved and treacherous terrain made the spindling journey last about an hour. All the while, the moon's reflection off the Nile Hassie acted as a sort of guide, the only beacon of light aside from her zigzagging high beams, which weren't doing her much good anyway. She had almost struck 2 trees and killed a deer, so it was a relief when she first caught the first glimpse of a house. The first one she had seen in what felt like miles. It was a solitary, beat-up-looking place, engulfed in a nearly endless darkness, if not for the single bulb that illuminated the front porch. What the light revealed was about as tired-looking as she must have been, and for a moment, in her state of numbed wariness, it dawned on her that this whole thing might have been one big practical joke. A wild goose chase orchestrated by some dumb kids or a pissed-off camp operator and his girlfriend. She was a fool, and although she should have turned back, something in her, call it her drive or that sheer ambition, forced her from that Lincoln, up the front steps, and onto the welcome mat which, if it weren't trying to welcome her, definitely missed its hospitable mark, being about as tattered and worn as the note from her windshield. "Hello?" The voice was about as abrupt as the entire situation was, and yet she still wasn't expecting it. She was spooked. Through a crack in the door, she could make out a dimly lit face. A man, his skin lumpy and stretched, with jet black hair jetting out of his ears and nose. "I'm sorry," she said, composing herself. "Are you the one that left the note on my car?" The man nodded. "Yes." He tried to pull open the door when it snagged on the metal chain. He tried again, harder this time. "You've got to unlatch the..." Ella started, but before she could finish, the man ripped the chain from the dry, rotted wood, its hinges squealing as it opened wide, filling the dark house with the same dull glow of the porch light. "Thanks," she murmured and stepped inside. The first step she took forced her to dip about a half an inch or so into the floor, her weight forcing the wood to creak. She caught her bearings and surveyed the house as she approached a dining room table amidst what was, largely, an empty room, cast in the blackness of night. And rolling in from that darkness became a pungent, rancid smell. Perhaps a whiff of mucky lake water through an opened window, or a dead critter beneath the elevated flooring. Either way, it stunk like a skunk, and the man seemed not to notice, or not to care. "Well, I know what happened," he said, bending down to sit across from her at the table, interrupting her self-talk. The chair bowed at his sitting, for he was a larger man, and it creaked similarly to the floor. "And who are you exactly?" She smiled despite her facial muscles stiffening. The man took in a long, deep breath. "Well, I'm the bus driver," he said, his voice low and drawled, as if he were drugged or on drugs. "Well, I drive the bus for the camp." Ella nodded excitedly. Surely an employee, especially one with knowledge of the campgrounds, such as a bus driver, would have known something of note. She took out her pad and pen. "And what did you see, sir?" The man breathed in. "I'm "The river monkey?" he said. Ella laughed, but the man remained firm in his expression. "Stanley," he continued, "makes me dress up like a monkey." The man stood and stomped over to the closet, pulling it open and retrieving, from its depths, a large fur suit, brown and matted, like any of the run-of-the-mill gorilla suit from the 5 and dime Halloween store. The man dragged the suit over the table and laid it across the tempered wood. Ella ran her fingers through the fur and stared up at the man, whose demeanor was still unchanged. "Well, why does he make you play dress-up?" she said, a smile cracking her lips open. "Well, it says good for the camp," the man said. "Legends of the river monkey bring tourists and dollars." "And the kid?" Ella immediately said. "Well, he's okay." The man smiled elastically. "He's in on the joke." Ella blew out a confused sigh, rummaging her fingers through her long silky hair as what was a build-up and somewhat nervous laugh belched out from within her. "So it was a publicity stunt?" She laughed, shaking her head. I knew it. I damn well knew it. Well, what about the papers, the news?" "All in on the joke," he said. "Brings tourists and dollars." Ella slapped the table. A smile wider than her cheeks spread across her face. Of all the kooky stories she had heard over the years, over her many travels nationwide, this one was the kookiest. She pulled out her disposable camera and aimed it readily at the suit draped over the table's edge. Before she pushed the little black button, she stopped herself and glanced up at the towering man. "You don't mind, do you?" "No," the man said, lifting a large hand. She snapped away. After she was finishing snapping, she politely thanked the man and stood from her seat. This was going to make one hell of a story, and if she could manage an interview with Cody Hodgson, it might even make the front page of the next issue, she thought. "Thank you, Mr. Bob," the man said. "Bob, thank you." Ella turned to face the door when the long road ahead dawned on her. It'd be hours before she reached the hotel. "Might I use your bathroom?" she asked, turning back around to face him. Bob looked off in the shadowy darkness, assumedly toward the bathroom in question, and nodded his head slowly. "I'll only take a moment," she said before entering the darkness and finding her place. It was colder in this part of the house, and after her eyes adjusted, she could make out the frame of a door filled with the hue from a nearby window, overlooking Lake Nyalahasi. It really was a beautiful sight, but her enjoyment was cut short by the returning stench that quickly filled the room, even stronger than it was before. She locked the bathroom door and, not unlike her, began to snoop diligently. And when she stuck her nose too close to the shower curtain, she backed away, knowing all too well that she had found the source of the smell. With one tug, she pulled the curtain back, and a wall of that same stench hit her in the face. She teared up with one breath, stepped back, and had to force her eyes open to see what it was. A black mass laying in the tub. It was a body, that of a shriveled, eaten-away young boy. Cody Hodgson, no doubt. Before a moment to process, there was a thud at the door, a jiggling of the handle, before Bob's voice, muted and monotone, pushed through from the other side. "Open the door," he said. The handle jiggled again. "What the hell is this?" Ella screamed, but Bob didn't answer, and after a deafeningly silent moment, there was another loud thud from the other side of the door. "Open the door," the voice said. It was Bob's, but it was far deeper than even a moment before. Ella didn't respond. She had already shuffled along the bathroom wall to the window, trying to pry the rusted metal open. It wouldn't budge. The handle began jiggling faster. the thuds ramping into a succession of loud, heavy bangs. "Open! Open! Open!" the voice screeched. It was deep and booming. It no longer sounded human, as if Bob was completely replaced by something awful and animal. The repeated lone word from the voice began to lose all semblance of meaning, as though the voice itself didn't even know what it was trying to say. The handle kept spastically shaking until it flew off the hinges, falling to the floor and rattling. And then, suddenly, 2 long, hairy fingers poked through the hole where the handle once sat and scraped the wood violently. When they made little progress, they retreated, and the hole was instead filled by the nostrils of something huffing deeply through the small opening. The noises it made were panicked and shrill, like that of a tortured chimpanzee. Ella screamed, thrusting her pen into the brittle glass window with all her might. 2 jabs and it cracked, 3 and it shattered, and 1 leap off the toilet and she fell a story down and into the muddy grass below. She would have never loved the feel of mud and grass against her skin, but now it was the only thing she wanted to feel. Relief. She jumped to her feet and dashed for the car, not turning back. She could hear rummaging from within the house as she fled. A boost of adrenaline filled her as she turned the corner of the house and saw the Lincoln Continental, and with a final gust, she reached the car, flung open the door, and jumped inside, locking it immediately. She caught her breath, but only for a moment, as she shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The high beams flashed on, and that's when she finally saw it. The Nylahassee river monkey. It was halfway from the house to the lake, sprinting with all its might with a jagged stagger. It might have been 7 feet tall and covered in a mangy coat of jet black hair, and unlike the image in her head, it was lanky, not bulky like the traditional apes she'd seen at the zoo, and at the same time, it was like the image she had seen, the ugly one the Hake had drawn. It really was that ugly. In its arm it held Cody Hodgson, what was left of the boy anyway. He was hanging from its gangly hand, which nearly touched the ground, and from what she could tell, there was something else hanging off of its wet fur. Skin, type of rubbery suit fastened from human skin, which at one point she might have called Bob. It took a final glance over to the headlights, its beady eyes glowing with the reflection of the high beams, and jumped into the gloomy water without another beat. Ella, without waiting around herself, put the car in reverse and hightailed it out of there. All she had after that was a panic attack and a couple of pictures, mostly of a run-down summer camp in a dirty old monkey suit, which wasn't exactly going to make her story any easier. The house she'd come to find out was abandoned, and the body of little Cody Hodgson was, as she knew it, vacated from the premises, either in the stomach of that thing or somewhere along the bottom of the Nylahassee. The only thing left she had to go off of was her own testimony, which, given her track record of falsified tales, wouldn't have held up all too well either. No one would ever believe her. Not even the folks back at the downtown Tattletale, who never took any of this shit seriously anyway. And who could blame them? Who could blame her? That's at least the story they're going with that old camp, with variations here and there, of course. Some of the times the yarn is spun around the fire. The campers go into the gory details of how the river monkey ate her guts out. That one usually ruins most of the group's appetite for s'mores. Or, some of the times, fueled by her lust for that promotion of hers, Ella becomes the river monkey herself. A clever little plot twist for a bunch of middle schoolers, don't you think? The truth of the matter, if such a thing even exists for such a ridiculous campy story, is that, well, we'll never truly know. We either listen to the witness of a pathological liar, a greedy summer camp, a handful of conspiracy theorists, or a bunch of middle schoolers. It's funny, because that's exactly how the river monkey would have liked it. Couple's camping trip. It was a chilly October morning when they set out on their way. Fred Williams, his girlfriend Melanie, best friend Pete, and Pete's girlfriend Jacqueline. Fred was a quiet loner type who was never very popular in high school. Melanie was a sweet and charming girl who had quite a few friends in her social circle. And Pete was the kind of guy who thought he was God's gift to mankind, though he did care for his friends very deeply. Jacqueline liked to gossip and spread rumors more than anyone else they knew. This unlikely group of friends had become closer in their college years, as none of them went out of state while many of their other friends did. On the first weekend of the month, they had planned a camping trip to the woods near their hometown. Fred was the most familiar with the area, as he had been there several times as a Boy Scout on other camping trips. Pete and Jacqueline weren't thrilled about being away from modern conveniences, but spending time with Fred and Melanie was more important. When they arrived, they chose an open area surrounded by trees. It was serene and nearly silent as they began setting up their tents and the rest of their gear. They could hear birds chirping in the distance, and occasionally the rustling of falling leaves. They worked well as a team. Fred was reading the instructions for the tents. Pete hammered in the stakes for them, and Melanie started gathering nearby wood for a fire. Jacqueline searched the area for cell phone reception. She lamented that all the trees must have been blocking the signal. Once the tents had all been set up, the sun was beginning to set. They made a fire within a circle of rocks, as per Fred's suggestion, in order to keep it contained. Melanie produced marshmallows from her bag along with graham crackers and chocolate bars, and before long, the marshmallows were impaled by skewers and roasting for s'mores, and the entire group's enjoyment. Pete stated that he was bored, and Jacqueline suggested that they play campfire games. They started with Truth or Dare, but quickly found out that it was too childish, even for the gossip queen herself. Pete then suggested that they all tell each other ghost stories in an effort to frighten one another. He also added a drinking game component, which involved visible flinching becoming grounds for one to down a bottle of beer from the cooler. They agreed, and each of them began thinking of what story they would tell as they finished their s'mores. Pete decided he wanted to go first since he was convinced his story would be the scariest. He told a modified version of the Hook Man legend, which ended in the story's male protagonist punching the killer in the mouth and saving the day. Understandably, this scared no one, and as per another rule that had been set, Pete had to drink a beer because of it. He was mad, but only because of the fact that his story failed to frighten. He was certainly no stranger to drinking beer, and it was all in good fun anyway. Melanie told the tale of a college girl who had gone to stay at her roommate's house in the country over the holiday break. The weather was bad, the house was old, and there wasn't much to do. One night the girls were in the house alone, and a monster storm hit. The power went out and they decided to go to bed. They heard the door crash open, and the girl whose family owned the house went to close it. After a few tense minutes, she came back. Her frightened roommate reached out to touch her, and soon found her to be decapitated. The boys laughed it off as being ridiculous. Jacqueline jumped a bit at the ending reveal, so she started drinking her beer as she began to relate her story. She shared a story about a teenage babysitter asked to look after a pair of children while their parents were at a social gathering. The children had gone to bed early, and she was up watching television when she began to receive strange hang-up calls from a blocked number. After a few times, a whispering voice on the other end asked, "Have you checked on the children?" The girl began to feel threatened, so she called the police and asked them to trace the number the next time a call came. A more demanding voice accompanied the next call, ordering her to see what had happened to the children and claiming that she would be next. At first, they seemed to be sleeping safe and sound in their beds, but when she turned on the light, their throats had been slit and they were dead. At that moment, the police called back and informed her that the calls were coming from inside the house. She dropped the phone in terror and felt cold metal pressed against her throat. Pete flinched, causing him to have to drink another beer. Melanie and Fred both said that they had seen that in a recent movie and it wasn't very well made. And finally, it was Fred's turn, and his expression turned very stern and serious. He spoke of a demon that likes to roam forests and wooded areas like the one they were camping in. The demon preys on the souls of the weak, he said, looking around at each of his friends. He once possessed the man in a car with his son and forced him to crash into a brick wall, killing him. The little boy watched his father die before his eyes and could do nothing about it. Fred claimed that the demon was responsible for a variety of unexplained deaths and disappearances, including another boy who went missing from Pennsylvania, and the brutal murders of a group of office employees on a camping trip of their own. He said it resembles a collection of animals molded together as one being. It has hooves for feet, a tall ape-like body, spade-shaped tail, claws like a rodent, and bat-like wings, the head of a goat, and eyes like that of a snake. He concluded by saying that you could summon the demon by saying its name, and then he shouted, "Salrak!" Everyone jumped and subsequently had to drink a beer. They went to bed shortly thereafter and all was quiet. He got up late at night because all the beer he drank required him to relieve his bladder frequently. He went into the trees and was quickly breathing a sigh of relief. Several minutes went by and he didn't return to his tent. Jacqueline had woken up and was still shaken from all the scary stories. She waited for him to come back and comfort her, and when he didn't, she knew that something was wrong. She went over to Fred and Melanie's tent to see if they were still awake. She didn't want to disturb anyone if they were sleeping, but she was concerned about her boyfriend's safety. She took a flashlight with her and roamed the nearby woods, calling his name at about average speaking volume. Off in the trees she went until something startled her. She screamed for only a second or two before her flashlight fell to the ground and silence enveloped the night once more. Melanie heard the scream though. She asked Fred if she had heard it too. He said it was probably just Pete playing a joke on her to make up for not scaring anyone before. Melanie was still concerned and wanted Fred to check on them. He did, and quickly reported back that they weren't in their tent or in the immediate area. She insisted that they had to go look for their missing friends, because she was too scared to be left alone, and they couldn't wait until morning. They grabbed their flashlights and started combing the area just beyond the fire's light. They moved out further and further, finding only more trees. They were within shouting distance of each other, but separated to cover more ground. Suddenly, Pete's mutilated body fell from a tree in front of Melanie, and she screamed in terror. Fred ran to her, but it was too late. She had disappeared into the darkness, leaving only her flashlight behind. He picked it up and saw Pete's body on the ground. Hanging from a nearby tree was Jacqueline's body, with her throat ripped out. He stumbled back to retreat to the campsite and fell to the ground. He reached for his flashlight and quickly discovered that he had tripped over the dead body of Melanie. Having no time to mourn the loss of his closest friends, he scurried back to his feet and made a beeline for the dim light of the campfire. A dark figure followed him there. He could hear footsteps in the leaves behind him. He turned around and saw that it was the very creature he was describing to his friends earlier in the evening. It closed in on him, breathing deeply through its snout. He knew the beast was about to do the same thing to him as it had done to his friends. He closed his eyes, swallowed the saliva in his mouth, and braced for it. The creature swung at Fred with its claws, and he ducked out of the way, surprising it. He grabbed a pocket knife from the back of his pants and slashed the thing's arms open. He took the blood from it with his fingers and applied it to his tongue. Smiling, he said, "This is for my father, you son of a bitch." He then said indistinguishable words from some ancient language, and both beings blacked out. Fred awoke, staring at his frightened body from above. He heard his own voice pleading for mercy, but he showed none. He reached down and ripped his own throat out. His arm was still cut, but it was healing quickly. As he walked away from the campsite, he remembered the words that came from his father's mouth just before the crash. "He who makes a beast of himself gets rid of the pain of being a man." Why I don't go to camp anymore. I've been attending Camp Rockwater for about 4 years now. I just loved camping, being able to see some new faces, getting to do fun and exciting activities. My favorite part was the river rope swing. I never wanted to leave that swing once I got on. I was just so excited to go back, mainly because it would be the last year I went. Summer finally came and it was time to head to camp. When I got there, after a 4-hour car ride, I was so excited. I was just on a big nostalgia trip, remembering all of my old favorite places. First things first, my mom had to take me into the lodge to get signed up. When we got into the lodge, there were a lot of people there. We waited in line until it was our turn to sign up. Before we were handed any papers, the lady at the table told us that there had recently been some weird things going on a few miles down through the woods from us. I just kind of ignored it. My mom helped me lug my suitcase to the cabin. When we got there, I was so happy to see some of my old friends from last year. Kyle, one of my longtime camp friends, was sitting in a corner making his bed. Jacob, another of my really good friends, was on the floor taking stuff out of his bag. And who could forget about Brad? He was still putting stuff in the closet, like baseball bats and golf clubs. As for the other 2 kids, I had no idea who they were, but they both seemed to like me. It turns out they were brothers. Their names were Brandon and Nathan, and it was their first year. They were kind of nervous. We all got settled in, and after our parents left, we sat down and started talking about past adventures in camp. It wasn't for another hour that our cabin leader arrived. When he got in, he kind of looked at all of us with a gloomy face. He turned to us and said, "Hey guys, I'm your cabin leader for the next 2 weeks. Now, before we do anything, I have to tell you that some things have changed, and we will have to be more cautious due to the strange things that have been happening." We were all a little uneasy, but we wouldn't let that stop us from having the best summer ever. The day continued on as normal. We introduced ourselves, played some cards in our cabin, went outside and played basketball, went to the mess hall to eat, and came back to the cabin to sleep. It was kind of odd that there were only 6 cabins full of people. Usually there are around 30. So the next day when we woke up, It was raining hard. The sounds of the rain smacking the metal roofs of the cabins echoed off in the distance. The camp leader was nowhere to be found. We kids kind of sat around the middle of the cabin, just waiting for him to get back. We started talking about some ghost stories that happened around the camp. Some of them seemed completely stupid, but others were kind of scary. Outside of our cabin, there was about 400 acres of forest, and in those woods, there were some obstacle courses, the chapel, and the river. There was one more thing in the woods that nobody really knew about, because it was so far off. It was the original Camp Rock water cabins. There were only a few of the older cabin leaders that knew about it and how to get to them. Supposedly, back in the early 1900s, when the camp was first established, 2 kids got into a fight in their cabins. One killed the other in his sleep. He had apparently taken a heavy rock and dropped it on the other boy's head. Legend has it that the presence of the boy who was killed lurks around the old campground and chapel. The boy could sometimes be seen crying at the back of the chapel, and someone even said they went to the cabins and saw his head peeking out from one of the windows. Now at this point, everyone in our cabin was really scared, and I swear Brad was going to have a panic attack. Then our group leader came rushing in through the cabin door. He told us that we needed to pack our things and go to the lodge. He would have to call our parents in the morning to tell them to take us home. We walked all the way from our cabin to the lodge in the rain, completely drenching our stuff. When we got there, only 4 other cabins were there. As I was sitting next to the fireplace with my cabin mates, we overheard people talking about what was going on. Someone had said that all of Cabin 6 had gone missing after returning from chapel. Later that night, I woke all my friends. I wanted to go check out what had happened in the woods. Though at first they were very hesitant, they still agreed to tag along with me. We grabbed a few flashlights and snuck past the cabin leaders that were sleeping near the exit. And when we got outside, it was still raining, but now it was pitch black outside. This didn't stop us from heading over to the woods. When our group finally got to the mouth of the woods, Brad and Jake just couldn't do it. They sadly walked back to the lodge through the shortcut in the gardens. All that were left were Kyle, Brandon, Nate, and I. We walked slowly through the thin path towards the chapel, and every now and then we would trip over some uprooted trees, but we still kept going. We could see the chapel ahead of us, but there was something wrong. It was very quiet. The rain had stopped. There was no wind, nor any kind of animal in sight. As we walked up to the chapel, Brandon, who was carrying one of the flashlights, just started screaming. He ran as fast as he could back towards camp and dropped his flashlight. The light was shining towards the chapel, and through one of the illuminated windows, we saw the face of a child crying. We all screamed and started to run towards the camp, and out of fear, we all lost sense of direction and had no idea where we were. We came up to a ravine that led down to the river. There was a small black figure that blocked our path. Our only way out was taking the ravine. Nate, Kyle, and I began scaling down the side of it, and we noticed another figure, but of our own. I shined my flashlight down a ways, and there was Brandon laying dead, head smashed in, blood everywhere. He must have tripped on an uprooted tree and fallen down the side of the ravine, but we had to just keep running. We were halfway down the ravine, and we could feel the sweat falling into our eyes like ocean water. And there it was again, a figure of a little boy standing at the end of the ravine, waiting for us to play with him. I told everyone to just keep running. I looked behind us, and Nate had disappeared. Completely gone. Kyle and I saw the old stairs coming up on our left that led back up to the part of camp. When we got to them, we were almost to the top. we could hear a kid saying, "We can play with the rocks." We didn't stop to look back. We ran all the way to the lodge. When we got there, all the cabin leaders were awake. 2 other cabins had left to go investigate what was going on in those woods, and they both went missing. Kyle finally spoke up. He hadn't said anything all night until now. "I saw him. The boy just wanted to play with us." Now, years had passed since that encounter. Kyle was sent into a mental hospital for some serious trauma. Jake and Brad were found buried under that chapel after they demolished it. Their bodies were cut up, their hands cut off and put into a small chest across from them. As for the other 3 cabins of kids, nobody ever found out what happened or where they went. Maybe they just didn't care. I found something in the camp lake 20 years ago. It's been 20 years since I worked as a counselor at Camp Valleyway. 20 years that I've tried to forget what I've seen, lying to myself and others about what I know happened. And for many of those years, I succeeded in fooling myself, pushing the dark thoughts into a hidden place in my mind. But after reading the newspaper today, I could lie no longer. Let me begin with my story. I started when I was 15. I started work when I was 15, spending my summers away at Camp Valleyway. The camp was nestled in the foothills of the Appalachians, cupped in a valley between 2 mountains with a natural lake at the center, its waters stained murky with southern clay. I worked as a swim instructor, and each week a new set of campers traveled from across the state to experience the outdoors. I still remember the exact day it happened. Tuesday, 5th week of camp, the hottest day of that summer, and just before the 4th of July. That week was known as Rich Week to the counselors, since many of the wealthier parents took off for the holiday and left their children behind. It came right after the Orphan Week, which was when the Clarkstown Orphanage, the largest in the state, traveled to camp free of charge because the camp was government-owned. Yearly, the local residents came by at the end of the week, and children were often adopted. Just last week, a girl in my class had found a new home with some farmers a few miles out, and I remember seeing Ellie wave from the cab of a pickup truck as she started her new life in the country. Now, as a swim instructor, in my time off, I helped the sail instructors patch sails under the water sports canopy. Logan, the head of water sports and about 5 years older than me, sat across from the picnic tables, his small eyes looking over the lake. Logan kept his hair in a tight buzz cut, revealing a scar around the back of his head, and when he spoke, it was in a deep southern drawl. "Mike, what you doing?" he growled, noticing I had skipped the stitch. "I only got 2 eyes, and there's too much going on for me to watch everyone today." "Got it," I said, and I put my head down. Logan kept a tight watch on his crew, but now his focus was on the lake. Ed and Ted, 2 twin counselors with 1 brain between them, were teaching a beginner's swimming course. Ed and Ted always made Logan uneasy, and had earned a spot of 1st and 2nd on his mental list of instructors who were most likely to screw up next. So when Ed, the smaller of the 2, came sprinting up from the lakeside so fast his long legs spewed a dirt exhaust behind him, Logan was ready. Ed opened his mouth, words wheezing in between each intake breath, and his wet hair plastered over 1 eye. We're missing one camper. We can't find him in the water. Friends don't know where he is either." And without hesitation, Logan's whistle shrieked through the campground, startling campers and counselors alike. "Out of the water! Out of the water! All lifeguards to the dock!" he shouted, his deep chest working like a bellow as adrenaline shot through me and we ran to the water. As a lifeguard, it was our responsibility to search for the body, and 15 of us lined up in one end of the swimming section. At Logan's call, we dove, myself in the deep end at 14 feet, and we spread out across the bottom. The water filtered sunlight and heat, so the bottom was cold and dark, with underwater plants that gripped against my calves and pulled me back as I swam. After 3 strokes, I returned to the surface, and Loga sent us back down again to search, hoping to find a still warm form. I was the one who found the body, its hand brushed against my face, a pale palm that was too white. I saw the face next, too dark to recognize, but a girl, with long hair that fanned around her like she was under static electricity. I gasped, involuntarily drawing in water into my lungs, gripped her torso, and began swimming to the surface. She felt swollen, her arms too big, and her temperature a cold that I will never forget. Halfway to the surface, I felt her leg catch on something, and she was being pulled back down out of my grip. I turned, watching her open eyes on mine as she descended, but my lungs screamed, and I knew I needed air, or I would join her down below for much longer than intended. "I found her," I shouted, breaking the surface. "Quick!" And I dove back down, my hands sweeping through the muddy bottom. But I found nothing but muck and empty water, even as the other lifeguards joined. 5 minutes later, and Logan's whistle ran out again, calling us to the dock. "The camper's been found," he announced, "in a restroom by his site. Ed and Ted must have let him slip past. Both of them will spend this night scrubbing the dock with your own toothbrushes." He paused, and I felt the other lifeguard's gaze fall on me. "Y'all free to go, except for Mike. Mike, a word, if you will." The others trudged away, looking back at us over their shoulder. Logan focused on me, spittle meshing with his words as he hissed, "Now I don't know what in the hell that was about, Mike, but you could have cost us a life with your false call back there. And the next time you try something like this, I'll take yours." "But I saw something," I insisted. "I don't believe in ghosts, Mike, and we scoured that water. Now get the hell out of my sight. You're off, waterfront." He left, and word spread around camp about what had happened. I could tell many of them detested me, and no one believed what had happened, so I quit the next week and pushed the thought from my mind, though it still found my dreams. That was 20 years ago, and today I hold the newspaper, the top article calling back my memories. Murders at Camp Valleyway. 19 skeletons have been discovered in the lake of Camp Valleyway, several aged at over 30 years since time of death, and none younger than 10. Due to renovations, the lake was drained, revealing a collection of bones at the deepest region. Several femurs were found attached to anchors with rope, and after much investigation, the state police discovered the source of the bodies. 10 years ago, before Clarkstown Orphanage was shut down for embezzling state funds, each summer their orphans spent a week at the camp. 19 were thought to be adopted by locals in nearby proximity to the camp. But after reviewing records, police have discovered these adoptions were never documented. All 19 were drowned and disposed of in the lake, at an area too deep for the campers to normally enter, except for one that drifted near the swimming area, due to an insecure rope. It is believed that the orphanage collected funds appropriated for these children long after their death. Police encourage anyone with information on the matter to step forward. Project Cronus. A few years ago, I went on a camping trip with 3 of my close friends. Darius, Ethan, and my sister, Maddie. It was late in November and the weather was cold, wet, and gray. We were in the woods, miles away from our town, and everything had become more distant and darker. After a few hours of hiking, we settled into a tent for the night. Our tent wasn't a fancy one like a four-season one with poles and stakes, but it was just right for us. There was some tension brewing between Darius, Ethan, and Maddie, and I knew why. Darius was the butt of my sister's jokes for one reason. He was a lumberjack's son. Ethan, understandably, didn't like this. For a while, we sat around our campfire listening to music and goofing around, but at some point, the rain started to come down again. I think it's safe to say all of us were wet, miserable, and cold. As we sat around an electric heater, cheating, I know, Darius frowned and got up. "This isn't going to be enough," he said. "I'll grab some firewood. I'll only be a few minutes." "Try not to take too long," Maddie chuckled. "We don't want the hide behind getting you." Darius frowned and shrugged, picking up a shopping bag we brought with us, and started walking into the forest. "Why you gotta be so mean to the guy?" Ethan said, chastising Maddie. "Just because he's a lumberjack's kid doesn't mean you get to make fun of him." Maddie shrugged. "What can I say?" she said. "He's..." What? What, some might call a redneck? Why don't you leave the poor guy alone for once, Madison?" Madison scoffed and glanced towards me. "It's fine to make fun of people, right, Sophie?" "Can we just stop bickering?" I said plainly. "We're here to have fun, not to tear each other's throats out." There was silence for a few moments. "All right," Maddie finally said, defeated. We waited for a few more minutes, then 10 more minutes, then half an hour. Darius didn't come back. After a while, we started getting a bit impatient, but not especially worried. Darius probably went to the other side of the lake, or the other side of the forest. Or maybe he went somewhere else altogether. We were used to that kind of thing. We'd never known him to turn up more than 5 minutes late. "Where is he?" Ethan said after a while. "He's been gone for an hour and a half now." "You're right," I said, sighing. "Guess we'd better find him." "Hold on, you're suggesting we drop everything and go into those woods without so much as a baseball bat to use as a weapon?" Maddie asked incredulously. I just nodded. "Yes," I said. "He might be injured somewhere, or even worse." "He'll know we're looking for him," I said. "We're going to have to follow him." "Right," said Ethan. As he got up, Maddie made a point of staying put. "Well, I'm staying here," she said. "Fires keep wild animals away, and I don't exactly want to end up face to face with a grizzly bear." Ethan shrugged as I got up. "It's either this or leave a man who's mortally wounded," he said, and with that he began walking into the woodland. I gave Maddie a final glance and a shrug, and followed Ethan. As soon as we'd left the small clearing, Ethan took off running towards the west. He'd reached the edge of the forest before I caught up with him, and after a few minutes later, we'd found a trail. The trees here were mostly pine, with a few maples scattered amongst them, and the smell of smoke and the tang of sulfur came from the all-encompassing darkness. During the day, a place such as that would look truly beautiful. But in the dark, though, the low visibility lent a sense of foreboding to the area. "This feels weird," I said after a few minutes. "I can't exactly say I like it here." Ethan shrugged. "Either way, maybe we'll find Darius here." The trail was almost a straight line, but even in the fog I could tell that it took us away from the edge of the forest to the west. As we walked, the air grew hotter and thicker, until it seemed to me that I was breathing through a sponge. I could feel it as a weight on my back and chest, and I tried to draw in the warm air as best as I could. But that was when I realized something was completely wrong. Why was it hot and humid in the late fall? I think Ethan realized around the same time I did. "This is wrong," he said, looking around. "It's not right. This place isn't right." "I know," I said. "Why is it this hot in November?" The sky tore apart with a violent crash of thunder. In the distance, there was a flash of lightning. Just our luck. A storm. We reached a fork in the trail, one that seemed to lead toward the western end of the forest. There was a slight gust of wind, and I cringed as a foul odor, a horrid stench of decay, filled my nostrils. "Oh, what the hell stinks?" Ethan said. "No clue," I replied. We looked at each other, and I could tell that he was as confused as I was. We collectively decided to keep walking, and tried our best to ignore the stench. Eventually, though, I gave up. "Screw this," I said, walking into the smell's direction. I had to know what it was. I shoved the vegetation aside with one hand, covering my mouth and nose with the other hand, and then my gaze rested on a large rotting mass on the ground. And by large, I mean huge. The corpse of some immense creature lay on its side, the maw open wide, and its cow-like eyes frozen with a look of confusion and panic. Its tongue lolled out of its beaked jaws, hanging lifelessly from the side of its open mouth. Black, putrid fluid oozed out of the many wounds covering its body. The remnants of a small, flashy comb topped its head, reduced to a flap of graying, desiccated, and rotting skin. "Jesus," Ethan muttered. "What the hell is that?" "I have no clue," I said plainly. Honestly, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to know what the creature was. There was another bright flash, followed by thunder. I tried counting how many seconds came between the lightning and the noise. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5. There was another ungodly crash. 5 seconds. That meant it was just close to a mile away. "Holy shit," Ethan whispered. Then there was another, closer flash of lightning above the forest nearby. I could have sworn the trees moved. It was almost imperceptible, almost too fleeting to tell, but I was sure I saw it. Then came the thunder and something else. The ground began to tremble as if the earth beneath us was shifting, as if it were about to collapse. Just as quickly as the sensation came, it stopped. The trees ahead began to shake and tremble as the form of some great beast came closer. It was big. It had to be. Nothing else in the forest could do this. The trees kept moving, as if some almighty god of the forest was making its way towards us. And come to think of it, it may as well have been. The trees closest to us began to tremble, their branches rustling as if they could snap off. And just then, the thing came out of the trees. I got a quick glimpse of a huge boxy head, a set of huge, powerful legs, and a long tail. And then I ran like hell. "What the hell is that?" Ethan shouted. I didn't reply. The ground trembled again like some gargantuan alligator broadcasting its intentions towards us. There was another sound now, like a distant rumble of thunder, which could have only come from the behemoth. We dived through the trees to our right, the branches scratching at our skin as we forced our way through. We got deeper into the forest, our breaths coming in heaves as we ran. I realized we were running uphill now, and as I looked back to the thing that was chasing us, I could see that it was gaining on us. Small beady eyes glared malevolently at us as it came closer, its mouth opening to reveal huge teeth, each the same length and width as a rail spike. I screamed. Ethan was sprinting after me, and I could see that he was struggling. "Sophie, it's coming closer," I heard Ethan grunt as we reached the top of the hill, sprinting down the other side. Something smashed through the trees behind us. and the noise was almost deafening. The wind whistled in my ears, sounding like the scream of a banshee. "Faster!" Ethan shouted. I heard him stumble behind me as the wind seemed to cut off his shout. I could feel my body struggling to climb the hill, my breathing labored, my head pounding so hard that I couldn't see straight. I felt as if I'd been running forever, like I was going to vomit. Ahead of us, the ground suddenly disappeared, and a huge slope descended into the valley before us. The rumble sounded again from about 20 feet behind us. It was close now, really close. It was a toss-up between the jaws of death and a few broken bones. I heard the agonized scream of Ethan behind me, followed by the sound of bones crunching. The decision had been made for me. I rushed forwards, towards the ravine. It looked like there was water at the bottom. And so, I jumped. The wind blew into my face as I fell. It was almost deafening. The jaws of the thing above snapped shut on thin air. The water below rushed up to meet me. I hit the surface of the water with a force that knocked the air out of my lungs. I flailed through the icy water, trying to keep my head above the surface. I could feel the cold seeping through my body, my muscles seizing up. I could feel my limbs stiffening, but I couldn't stop struggling. I kept moving upwards until I broke the surface of the water. I could see the rocks rising up out of the water ahead of me, and the sky above me was so bright that it was almost unbearable. I climbed up onto the rocks. I was alive. I could feel the air on my back, warmed from the sun. I was so grateful to be alive that I almost burst into tears. I was close. I could see the opposite rock ledge a few feet away from me. And then I turned around, and I saw it. Scraggly filaments covered parts of its body. Powerful jaw muscles worked, crushing and grinding what little bone remained in its unfathomably large maw. A pair of small white eyes gleamed with a primal malevolence, ragged breaths escaping the gargantuan beast's jaws. The hellish thing before me was an apex predator. I had no doubt about that. A concoction of blood and saliva poured from the monster's open jaws, mixing with the water and clouding the water's surface. This is it, I thought to myself. This is the thing that just killed Ethan. The realization hit me that I was looking into the jaws of death itself, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I wouldn't even look away from the thing. And I think it was at that moment that I just accepted my fate. At any moment, the thing was going to make its way down the canyon and devour me. There was a bright light, and the thing suddenly pulled its head back and turned around. A loud rumble shook me to my very core as something flew over, and the light became blinding. A helicopter. I began waving furiously, trying to get the attention of the chopper. It began descending into the canyon, bathing it into an eerie glow. I looked up and the thing was gone, and I watched, eyed wide and breathless, as the chopper landed, not even 100 yards from me, and I ran towards it, excited, scared, and hopeful all at the same time. I climbed in, hoping and praying for them to have found Maddie, or anyone else for that matter, alive. I felt like I could do anything. I was free. Inside the chopper, there was a man dressed in a bulky uniform with the acronym Cronus. I'd never seen an acronym like that before. These couldn't have been search and rescue people. I didn't know how to properly address the guy, so I blurted out, "Who? Who the hell are you? What was that thing?" The helicopter began to ascend as the man replied, "Calm down, miss. What's your name?" "Sophie. Sophie Whittaker." "What the hell was that thing?" The man didn't speak for a second. It was as if he was trying to decide exactly what to say. "A temporal aberration," he said. "It's the result of an anomalous change to the time-space continuum." "Anomalous aberration?" I said. "What are you on about? Is Maddie okay?" He shook his head. "I'm afraid there's a lot we don't know. There's no one alive on the ground." I didn't know what to say. The truth was that I was terrified. I was afraid that Maddie was gone, and there was no way she could still be alive. "And who are you?" I said after a few moments. The man frowned as if he wasn't expecting me to ask that, and he hesitated before he answered. "Well, I work for an organization called Cronus." "Well, yeah, no shit," I said. The man ignored me. "Well, we specialize in dealing with situations such as this. Temporal aberrations, I mean. We're named after the Greek personification of time. There have been many instances like this, all across the globe." "Like what?" He paused for a breath. "Well, I think we'd better get back to the compound first." "Compound?" I said, perhaps a little quicker than I would have liked. "What compound?" "Well, I suppose compound isn't exactly the best word for it. More like a facility or something." The helicopter flew on for a while. I think it was about 20 minutes until we reached the compound, but I wasn't paying too much attention. The walls of the place were made of some kind of dark gray material and had that prison feel to them. The helicopter landed on the roof, and the soldiers opened the door for us. I got out and felt my legs go a little wobbly. The compound was in a bad state, with burnt-out hulks of cars and wrecked machinery everywhere. We walked down a dark, narrow path made out of tarmac and concrete, which eventually stopped at a small metal door with a large red button on it. "Open it," the man said. The other man went up to the door and opened it. We entered the compound where a sign with a few lines of text was painted on the wall. The word Cronus was stamped underneath the lines of text, as well as several symbols that I didn't recognize. "What is this place?" I asked. "Some kind of government building?" "That's right," one man said. "Sorry for the mess," another guy joked, "but we ain't exactly the most well-funded organization. The government doesn't exactly believe that dinosaurs are roaming all over the globe. The feds used to take us seriously, and now we're just the crackpots of the United States." We entered a large open room. It was dimly lit, with only 2 windows with blinds on the windows. In the middle of the room was a round table with 2 chairs around it. The man who brought me here gestured for me to sit down, and so I obliged. The guy who opened the door came back into the room with 2 cups of coffee. "Thanks," he said as he put the cups down. "No problem," the other man said. "You're welcome." "So," the man said, "I thought you might want to know why you were here, what this whole thing's about, and what the hell is a temporal aberration." Not exactly knowing what to say, I just nodded. "Well, from what we understand, it's some sort of ripple effect that takes place in the space-time continuum. Somehow this results in the divergence of certain events from the pre-existent timeline, creating a new reality which runs concurrently with our own. And sometimes, just sometimes, animals from different times just appear." "Like what?" I asked, now even more bewildered. "Well, I can name you a few examples. There was a farm in Australia that was raided by some sort of megarepertorid. The farmer lost 7 of her sheep before it was gunned down. In another incident, the very fabric of reality regurgitated something. There was the unexplained disappearance of 3 people in the Philippines just a few months back. There was one survivor from the group, a gibbering wreck, the poor girl. Said something about a long neck, long legs, wings. kind of a head like that of a stork. But most of the sightings appeared to be of the Cretaceous taxa, Megaraptorid theropod, and of course what you saw, Tyrannosaurus rex. Hold on, I said. You're telling me my friend was eaten alive by a Tyrannosaurus rex? The man simply nodded. Something about the way he behaved just unnerved me somehow. It was as if he didn't even find any of this strange. And finally, he spoke again. Listen, we still don't understand how any of this works. Believe me, besides knowing what exactly results from these temporal aberrations, we're just as clueless as you are. At first, I felt as if the guy was just fucking with me. Obviously, he noticed a suspicious look in my eye or something, because the next thing I knew, he was pulling up some sort of tablet and practically shoving it into my face. Here, he declared. Here's the evidence. I took hold of the tablet. There were a few images. I can't remember how many, but there were at least 7. I only looked at 5. One of them depicting something tall, its legs blending into the trees, with a large beaked head. Another showed a large cadaver which had apparently washed up somewhere on a beach in Morocco. The creature's neck was twice as long as the rest of it. The third and fourth both showed some sort of large... well, I didn't know what the hell it was. Well, that there is a Jaculapterus renanae, the man said, explaining what the thing was. That thing, that's the biggest exoskeleton-bearing animal to ever live. I looked at the final image, which the label said was taken somewhere in the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. The photo was in sepia, and it looked like it was taken with an old Polaroid camera. The photograph depicted a snowscape, with a distant mountain range looming in the background. Sandwiched between them was a forest, maybe 200 feet from the camera. I saw... well, the thing stood on 2 powerful limbs, with a large muscular tail balancing its front half. Its arms were almost comically tiny, but they looked robust. And the head was huge, at least 5 feet long. The photo was too blurry to make out most of the details of its head, but I could make out that its eyes faced forwards. The snout was long and thick, and through its open jaws, I could just barely discern a set of large teeth. Well, that there's your animal. That's the Tyrannosaurus rex. That's from the first case we ever investigated, the man said without batting an eye. The photograph was taken shortly before Cronus established in 1933. The man let that sink in for a few moments. Then the interview continued. Nothing else interesting became of it. Just some routine questions and some background information that went straight over my head for the most part. After about a half an hour, it was over. But I still had one more question. Plucking up the courage to speak up, I asked, "So, what now? I mean, do I get to go home?" The man didn't look sure of himself for a few moments. It was as if he wasn't expecting that. "Well, how close was the campsite from your home?" he asked. "About 10 miles. Why?" He sighed. "Well, large predators have large territories. If our estimates are correct, an animal the size of a T-Rex, they have a home range of about 500 square kilometers. It might not be safe for you to go back home." I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to leave my home, the home I'd lived in for my entire life, but, temporary accommodation will be provided, of course, the man said. "We settle things with the authorities, of course. The disappearance of 3 people are going to seem suspicious. Besides you, we're the only people who know that." I shifted nervously in my chair, still trying to figure out exactly what to say. "Will I be able to move back?" I asked. "To my old home, I mean." "Well, of course," the man said. "Of course, as soon as the situation's been dealt with and things are settled with the authorities, you're free to go back home." "Will I started, but the man interrupted. "As soon as you get to your temporary accommodation," the man said. "Yes, this operation isn't exactly under any sort of embargo. It's more of a matter of whether anyone would believe you. Hell, it might even be good for this organization's credibility." He joked. We talked for a few more minutes and then the man got up. I stood and we shook hands, and with that, I walked out of the room. Questions buzzed through my mind all the while. No matter how much I tried to distract myself, I wondered what other information the man was withholding. I wondered what would happen to me if they decided that what I'd said was no longer part of the organization's interest. But none of that happened. I was given temporary accommodation, only about a half a kilometer away. I was assigned a bunk in a small room with 2 other people, whose names I will not disclose for obvious reasons. They were in the same situation as me. I was given clothes as well, and was given a little plastic bag to hold my few personal belongings. And that's where I am now. I'm writing all of this to get things off my chest. Except for my roommates, I've told nobody about this. I don't exactly know how to end this, besides with a warning. There's a lot about the world that we don't understand. The planet on which we live is a mysterious place. And the untamed, primal realms we have yet to explore conceal all sorts of creatures. Species that, by all accounts, should no longer exist, or should never have existed to begin with. It's a dangerous world out there. Cabin from Hell. Let me tell you a story. There's a small town on the outskirts of a slightly larger town, and the people there call it a city. And this is where I live. I live in a big house with a lot of land, though my favorite place to go has always been the forest. I love the big trees and the dense bushes, and the howl of the animals at night. In a small clearing in the midst of the woods and bordered by a field, stands a lone cabin. This was my clubhouse, my base of operations, my castle, my home away from home. I loved it. I decorated it and called it my own. My favorite times were when I would spend the night out there, my friends and I telling ghost stories and squealing late into the night. I didn't always stay out with a friend, though. The woods were my home. I loved them. I was never afraid. I would pack up my sleeping bag and march proudly down the trail with my little lantern until I came upon my cabin. I would unlock the door with my special skeleton key and set up my bag on the cot my mom had given me. I did this one night, one clear summer's night. I settled in per usual and listened to the sounds of nature, the chirps of crickets and whoos of owls, my lullaby, soothing me to sleep. I don't know when exactly it changed, though. I only know it was dark. The once abundant noise of the nocturnal forest faded, and the silence was so loud it jolted me awake. The forest only goes quiet for one of 2 things: a storm or a predator. I glanced up at the window in the wall above my head and saw at once there was no storm. The moon and the stars shone down on me like a million diamonds illuminating the black velvet of the night sky above the clearing. I figured there must have been a predator, some wolf or cougar on the prowl. The window was locked and the door barred. No matter what creature may be out there, I was safe. I snuggled back in and rolled to face the room, back against the wall. I began to drift back to sleep, reassured by my logic and the security of my little abode. A soft grunt came next to my ear, clearly heard through the paper-thin walls of my cabin. My eyes shot open, and I laid perfectly still as a subtle sniffing followed the grunt. I squeezed my eyes shut and held my breath, hoping that the creature would go away before making an attempt to break into my cabin. I smelled like prey and was on ground level. Of course it would attempt to pursue me. I only hoped it wouldn't hurt itself trying to break through the walls. My hope was misplaced, though. The sniffing stopped. I waited a few minutes and then I sighed. It had left, but something else was wrong. The light. The moon had cast a light through a small window above me, but that light was gone. Not completely, though. There was enough left to show the silhouette of a head and shoulders blocking the window. I rolled onto my back as quietly as I could and looked up. There was indeed something in the window, something for which I have no words for. I stopped moving, paralyzed, mouth open in a mock scream. It cast its head downwards, and its eyes, those awful, soulless red eyes, looked into mine, peering into the depths of my soul. And that is when I screamed, loud and shrill, a cry for life, mercy, help. And that is when it moved, faster than the eye can follow. The cabin, my safe haven, crashed in on me, and the world went black. Now, let me tell you another story. There's a small town on the outskirts of a slightly larger town. The people there call it a city. This is where I live. I lived in a big house with a lot of land, though my favorite place to go has always been the forest. I love the big trees and the dense bushes and the howl of the animals at night. The big house no longer exists, replaced by a worn-out shell comprised of a few sorry, crumbling walls. The woods are still there, though, and the field too, though now overgrown and unkempt. In a small clearing in the midst of these wild woods stands a lone cabin. Many stories are told about this cabin and about the things that had happened there all those years ago. What exactly happened, though? Well, nobody knows for sure. Some say it was a madman, escaped from a nearby prison. Others say it was a case of child abuse. Others still say it was an accident or an attack from a rabid animal. Hidden among these, though, mostly popular with the kids, are other theories. Supernatural theories. These theories range from demon to werewolf, but the major theme is curiosity. All their lives, children are told to stay out of those overgrown woods, but children never do as they're told. They're told that there is no cabin there, that the tales of the supernatural are wives' tales, urban legends. The children have a different idea, though. The cabin, they say, still stands, and whatever was there that night still lurks inside that wooden house from hell. This scares the children for a while, but as they grow older and more adventurous, they begin to question it. Then the dares start. I dare you to spend a night in Hell's cabin. And they do. Curious youngsters come every so often. I see them, their nervous faces flushed from the effort of the trek through the weeds and ivy. The looks of surprise and suppressed fear on their faces when they see the cabin is there, looming in the middle of the clearing. They usually come in groups, fear suppressing the desire to come alone. These groups stay, scared through the night. Then they leave. I watch, sad that they have come and gone, but some come alone. It is for these brave souls that I wait. I watch as the sun goes down and the crickets chirp, their noise lulling the child to sleep. I watch as the moon rises and the stars twinkle, and I leave my hiding spot. The forest goes quiet, and I watch as the silence disturbs the child. I watch through the window, my silhouette cast down onto the floor. I see the child freeze, fighting the urge to look out of the small window. and sometimes I have to knock, but they always give in to their curiosity eventually. With a turn of their head and mine, I meet their eyes. The look of confusion, then fear, as my deep red eyes penetrate deep into their soul, seeing their past, present, and reading their future. I grin, showing my pointed yellowed teeth. They open their mouths and scream. The cabin crashes, and the world goes black. I slip away as the sun peaks over the horizon, and I watch as yet another victim is found in the cabin from hell. The Cabin's Secret. Mark had always dreamed of owning a place in the woods, away from the noise and stress of the city. He was browsing online for some properties when he stumbled upon a listing that seemed too good to be true. A cozy, rustic cabin on a large plot of land, surrounded by pine trees and a lake, for a bargain price, of course. The only catch was that the seller, a widow named Mrs. Smith, wanted to meet the buyer in person and finalize the deal as soon as possible. Mark contacted Mrs. Smith and arranged to visit the next day. He drove for hours, following her directions until he reached a dirt road to the property. He parked his car and got out, admiring the scenery. The cabin looked even better than in the pictures, with a stone chimney, a wooden porch, and a swing. He knocked on the door and was greeted with a warm smile by a friendly old lady. "Well, hello, dear, you must be Mark. Well, I'm so glad you came. Please, come in. I've made some tea for us," Mrs. Smith said, inviting him inside. Mark followed her into the cabin, which was cozy and charming, with a fireplace, a sofa, a kitchen, and a bedroom. He noticed no pictures on the walls, no personal belongings, nothing indicating that something lived there. "So, Mrs. Smith, why are you selling this place? It's absolutely beautiful," Mark asked, sipping his tea. "Oh, well, you know, dear, I'm getting old and I can't take care of it anymore. My husband passed away a few years ago and, well, I have no children. I want to move to the city and be closer to my sister. She's been nagging me to do it for a long time," Mrs. Smith said with a sigh. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, but, you are lucky to have a sister who cares about you. I'm an only child and my parents are gone too. So that's kind of why I want to buy this cabin. I need a place to call my own to relax and enjoy nature," Mark said, feeling a connection with the old lady. "Well, that's very sweet, dear. I'm sure you'll love it here. It's very peaceful and quiet. The only thing you must worry about is the wildlife. Some bears and wolves are around, so you must be careful. But don't worry, though. The cabin is sturdy and safe. Well, it's been in my family for generations. It's like a living thing, It has a personality of its own. And sometimes, sure, it creaks and groans, but that's just its way of talking to you. It's very loyal and protective of its owners. It'll never let anything harm you," Mrs. Smith said with a fond look in her eyes. Mark smiled, thinking that she must be sentimental. He finished his tea and said, "Well, Miss Smith, I think I've seen enough. I absolutely love this cabin, and I would like to buy it. How much do you want for it?" Mrs. Smith smiled back and said, "Well, dear, you don't have to pay me anything. Well, I'm giving it to you as a gift. Consider it my way of thanking you for being kind and respectful. All I ask is that you sign this paper. It's just a formality. It says that you accept the cabin as it is, with all its quirks and flaws, and that you will never try to sell or change it. Do you agree?" Mark was stunned by her generosity. He felt a surge of gratitude and excitement. He didn't care about the paper. He just wanted to own the cabin. He quickly signed it and handed it back to her. "Thank you, Mrs. Smith. You're very generous. Wow, I can't believe this is happening. I'm so happy," Mark said, hugging her. "Oh, you're welcome, dear. I'm happy to. You're the perfect owner for this cabin. It will love you as much as I do," Miss Smith said, hugging him back. She let go of him and said, "Well, dear, I must go now. My sister is waiting for me in the city, and I've packed my things and I'm ready to leave. Well, you can stay here tonight and start your new life tomorrow. I hope you'll be very happy here. Goodbye, dear. Take care of yourself in the cabin." She grabbed her suitcase and walked out the door, leaving Mark alone in the cabin. He watched her go, feeling mixed emotions, but happy to have the cabin. Deciding to explore it more and make himself comfortable, he went to the bedroom and saw a large bed with a quilt. As he lay down on it, he felt a wave of relaxation, closing his eyes and drifting into sleep. Mark woke up in the middle of the night feeling a strange sensation. He felt like he was being watched. He opened his eyes and saw glowing red eyes staring at him from the darkness as the door to the room slowly creaked open. He gasped and tried to get up, but he couldn't move. He felt something heavy on his chest, something that was crushing him. He looked down and saw that the quilt was alive. It had teeth and claws, and it bit and scratched him. He screamed in pain and terror, but no one heard him. He realized that the cabin was the monster. It had lured him in with its charm and then trapped him. It was feeding on him slowly and painfully. He remembered Mrs. Smith's words. It was loyal and protective of its owners. It would never let anything harm them. It would never let them go. He wished he had never signed that paper. He wished that he had never met Mrs. Smith. He wished he had never seen the cabin. And he wished that he were dead. But then he woke up again. He was lying on the bed, covered with the quilt. He looked around and saw that everything was normal. The cabin was quiet and peaceful. He touched his chest and felt no pain or blood. He rubbed his eyes and wondered if it was all a dream, a horrible, vivid dream. He got up and went to the bathroom. He splashed water on his face and looked at himself in the mirror. He saw no marks or scars on his skin. He sighed and tried to calm himself down, and he told himself that it was just a bad dream caused by his excitement or anxiety, and that the cabin was not a monster, but a gift. Calming down, he returned to bed, pulled the quilt over him, and closed his eyes. As he tried to sleep, he felt a slight movement under the quilt. Then, a faint sound was heard like a growl, followed by a cold breath on his neck. He opened his eyes and saw the glowing red eyes again. Only this time, he realized it was not a dream, for he wasn't asleep yet. It was real. It was happening. A wave of panic and dread washed over him. His heartbeat quickened and his breath turned shallow and erratic. His mouth dried up and his skin grew cold and clammy. Mark's muscles tensed and twitched as his mind raced with thoughts of helplessness. Though a solid urge to flee, fight, or do anything surged within him, he found himself immobilized. And in that moment, the realization hit him. He was destined for a slow and painful demise. He cursed himself for accepting Mrs. Smith's offer without a second thought. Who gives away a cabin, especially one in the woods, no less for free? He asked himself as he grappled with his fear. He screamed, but it was too late. The quilt wrapped around him, dragged him into the darkness. The cabin swallowed him whole. He was the cabin's owner, and the cabin's prey. Ha Tonka. Ever since I can remember, I've always loved to hike. I grew up near the Mark Twain National Forest and fell in love with the dense woodlands, countless swift rivers, and rolling hills. You could walk for miles without any signs of civilization. There's something special to me about discovering new places and exploring nature at your own pace. Eventually, I had to move away from the country to go to college. I was disappointed with the established hiking trails near my university. Not because of the scenery, but because of the people. The city environment spoiled what made me passionate about my hobby. The once pristine trails from my memory were now littered with trash. People made too much noise and scared away the wildlife. These were not true hiking trails, but more exhibits of nature that were spoiled by convenience. I remember the first night I had the idea to go hiking after dark. Now at night everyone left the parks and nature trails, and the night was much cooler than the 100-degree daytime summer heat. All it took was one trip, and I was hooked. Usually I would go to the trail in the daytime and take a moment to scope out the park. My primary concern was avoiding the attention of the forestry wardens. Although there would probably be no serious consequences if I were caught, it added a small element of danger which made it more exciting. Up until this point, I'd been night hiking 15 or 20 times. But what happened during this trip changed everything. I've not been able to bring myself to go back since. I had been to the Ha Tonka State Park a couple of times before, but had never had a chance to see it at night. The park is beautiful, as I'm sure anyone who had seen it would say. The main feature of the park is the ruins of an old turn-of-the-century castle, constructed on a huge bluff overlooking the Lake of the Ozarks. The scenery consists of glades, meadows, natural bridges, sinkholes, and caves. Ha Tonka is translated as laughing waters, in reference to the gushing springs in the area. The park was well maintained and was crisscrossed with many trails, boardwalks, bridges, and outlooks. And here's some information on the park. The park is closed at sunset, so I had scoped out an area, mainly being concerned with a place to park that would not draw attention, and find an efficient way into the park after dark. I found the perfect spot, about a quarter of a mile past an old nearby post office. Since I was not familiar with the area and had to walk through the forest, I had marked the trailhead on my GPS and grabbed the trail map during the daytime so I could easily locate it at night. I got out of my car and got my gear ready for the trip. I set my location on my GPS so that I would be able to locate my car at night without any problems. It was a little after midnight when I set out to find the trailhead. The night started off beautifully. It was a full moon that night, and it allowed plenty of light to see where I was stepping. I remember it was warmer than usual that night, but there was almost no wind at all, which was perfect. Less wind meant that I would be able to hear wildlife, or forestry wardens, before they saw me. After about 30 minutes, I found the trailhead easily enough and got started on my way. I continued to walk through the woodland and came upon a large clearing. Before entering the clearing, I paused for a moment to take a drink of water and to allow myself to become acquainted with the sounds of the night. I closed my eyes and listened to the crickets and the tree frogs which echoed throughout the forest. After placing my water bottle back into my pack, I looked across the glade to see if I could spot any people or wildlife, but I didn't see anything. I paced slowly at first to warm up and to preserve my strength. The scenery went from an open meadow to scattered shrubs, and became denser and denser until I was surrounded by dark forest. The moon showed through the trees and provided enough light to see without a flashlight. Stripes of moonlight that filtered through the tree limbs projected onto the path. I noticed a large rock on the side of the trail and took note of it as to not trip over it in the dark. As I got closer, it became clear what I was looking at. I turned on my flashlight, careful to keep the light low to the ground, and what I saw paralyzed me. It was a dead deer. Now, I've hunted a fair amount in my youth, which included skinning, field dressing, and butchering, so I had seen many in my lifetime, but I had never seen anything like this, and will always have a picture of it ingrained in my memory. It was a white-tailed buck, which was common to the area. It was about 200 pounds and had an 8-point rack. I've happened upon dead deer while hiking, which didn't make this too rare. If you don't get a good shot at a deer, it'll bolt, and if it's injured, it'll eventually bleed out and die. But get far enough so that the hunter will not find it. I've also seen deer which maybe a coyote or a stray dog may have run down and eaten. As soon as the light shone upon it, I felt something was wrong. The skin was missing. It was not unheard of to find a deer that something had been eating on, but the thing was, it didn't have the appearance of it. Its muscles, tendons, and bones were exposed from its hooves to the base of its skull and were untouched. I then noticed something else. Its head was lopped around backwards. Something had snapped its neck. The eye, or where its eye should have been, was facing upward and was gone. I don't know how such a thing would happen, as obviously nothing in nature would do that. Someone would have to shoot or run down the buck and use enough force to yank the head of a large buck 180 degrees. I mean, why would somebody do this if the deer was already down for the count? Then, there was its skin. I flicked my flashlight around and didn't see any fur, marks, or tracks other than footprints of the daytime hikers. When wild animals eat, they usually rip parts of the fur off, leaving a fairly large amount of fur scattered on the ground. No smell, no signs of rot, no flies or maggots, and most of all, this was a public trail, so things like this would be cleared in the daytime. So I wondered if it was still warm, but I really didn't like the idea of touching it. This was done very recently. Not wanting to stick around, I put my flashlight away and walked away. I really was not frightened at that point, but I was a little bit on edge. My senses were sharper. I stepped more closely and with caution so I could hear well. In this distance, I heard the faint murmuring sound of the waters the park was named after. As I walked, the sound increased. The sound of the quick running water sloshed over rocks sounded like a soft whisper with a slight hints of snickering. I could not see the stream, but I knew it had to be close. It had been about 30 minutes since I had seen the deer, and I wanted to get my bearings. I opened my pack and took a drink of water. I retrieved the trail map I took from the forestry department during the daytime, and I compared it with my GPS location. There were no streams within a half a mile. I stopped breathing and listened. I didn't hear anything. The sound of the water was gone. And for an instant, I did become scared. But I did manage to calm myself. I rationalized. It was probably the wind and not a stream. The sound of a steady wind through the dense forest could easily sound like running water. I was about halfway through the hike and following a trail loop which would bring me back near where I could get back to my car. I picked up the pace. The terrain became more rocky and rugged. The left side of the trail grew into a large cliff face, and the right side of the trail was a large drop. And this is when I first heard it. I stopped for a moment to listen harder and realized that it was coming from behind me. It sounded like a faint step on loose gravel and a dragging sound. Because of the bend in the trail and the cliff facing, I could not see anyone behind me, but knew that whatever it was very close. I remember thinking it was strange that I was able to hear something that faint when I noticed that there were no other sounds. I felt my skin prickle and my hair stand on end, and I was rooted into place with an unexplained feeling of fear. Fixed in place, I watched the trail behind me for a few moments and listened closely. Crunch. Scrape. Crunch. Scrape. Throwing caution to the wind, I called out, "Hello?" But it stopped, and everything went silent. I wanted to run. My body was teetering between fight and flight, but I was paralyzed with fear. My eyes were fixed on the path behind me, and I stared long enough that the edges of my vision grayed and tunneled. A slight breeze blew softly through the trees, which made a whispering sound. Was that the wind? I looked at the dense foliage around me, and nothing moved, although the sound still persisted. Did I get closer to a stream and not notice it? The sound was growing louder now, and it was coming for me. Crunch. My eyes darted back to the path behind me. There was something there. A shadowy form was hunched down over the trail. Its edges were blurred from the shadows of the trees. I would say it moved, but that is because that is the closest thing I can relate it to. It borrowed the neighboring shadows as its form raised up from the trail. A single eye reflected the moonlight in the center of its mass. The slight whispering sound increased sharply to a swell of gibberish, chatter, and a chorus of laughter. That was it. Flee with flight feet or meet defeat. I ran faster than I had ever had before. Adrenaline pumped through my body as I dashed down the trail. I was not able to see the blazes marking the trails, but know I was both running away from it and towards my car. The trees around me blurred as I sprinted. The world around me became a distortion of moonlight and darkness. I ran until I could no longer ignore the sharp pain in my lower stomach and was completely out of breath. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. I then tried my best to calm my breathing and to listen. I took out my GPS and I looked to see how close I was to my car. I had little less than a mile, but I had to leave the trail to get back to where I had parked. I could still hear the murmuring in the night, but it was very slight, and that's all I needed. I kept the GPS in hand so I didn't have to stop and take it out, and I quickly jogged to the point I would exit the trail and have to go through the forest to get back. Moving through the forest was both slower and noisier. At about 100 feet from the trail, I chanced to look back. The eye was there, and it was looking at me. I could not tell if the trees were moving, or if it was only their shadows. Darkness wavered and flowed around it, and it was coming, no longer caring about being heard or seen. I took off. I don't remember how I made it or how long it took. I vaguely remember the pain from running, but I didn't care. I got to my car, and I got the hell out of there. And I've never told anyone about it since. The Shadow in the Pines. The car rattled along the gravel road, the tires crunching against the stones like bones underfoot. As they approached the entrance to Pine Hollow Forest, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced ominously among the trees. Daniel, a wiry 10-year-old with tousled hair and wide, curious eyes, peered out the window, his heart racing with excitement and a hint of dread. "Are we there yet, Dad?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence that had settled in the car. "Almost, buddy," replied Mark, his father, a rugged man in his late 30s with a weathered face and a reassuring smile. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, glancing at the darkening sky. "Just a little further." Mark had promised Daniel an adventure, a chance to bond in the great outdoors, away from the distractions of their everyday lives. But as they entered the forest, the trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A chill ran down Daniel's spine, but he brushed it off, determined to enjoy the weekend. They parked a car at a small clearing, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Mark unloaded their gear while Daniel bounced around, his energy bubbling over. The sun had fully set now, and the forest was enveloped in darkness, the only light coming from the flickering lantern Mark had set up. "Let's get the fire going," Mark said, his voice steady despite the oppressive darkness. He knelt down, striking a match against the rough surface of the box. The flame flared to life, illuminating his face and casting flickering shadows that danced around him. Daniel watched, mesmerized, as the fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. "Can we tell ghost stories?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Sure, but let's wait until it's really dark," Mark replied, a hint of caution in his tone. "We don't want to scare ourselves too much, though." As the night deepened, the forest came alive with sounds. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else, a low, almost imperceptible growl that seemed to reverberate through the ground. Daniel shivered, glancing around the darkened trees, but Mark's presence was a comforting anchor. "Hey, Dad? Do you think there are monsters in the woods?" Daniel asked, half joking. Mark chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "Well, only the ones we make up in our heads. Remember, the only thing to fear is fear itself." But as the fire flickered and the shadows lengthened, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The darkness felt alive, watching and waiting. The fire crackled and the two of them settled into their camping chairs, the warmth wrapping around them like a blanket. Mark began to tell a story about a brave knight who fought a dragon, but Daniel's mind wandered. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "Dad, do you think we could maybe just go for a walk?" he asked, hoping to dispel the creeping unease. "Sure, but let's stick close to the firelight," Mark replied, standing up and grabbing a flashlight. They ventured a few feet into the trees, the beam of light cutting through the darkness like a light. As they walked, Daniel's imagination ran wild. Every rustle of leaves felt like a whisper. Every snap of a twig echoed like a warning. He glanced back at the flickering fire, its glow a comforting beacon in the oppressive blackness. "Look, Dad," Daniel exclaimed, pointing to a cluster of fireflies dancing in the air. "They're like little stars." Mark smiled, but his eyes darted around, scanning the shadows. "Yeah, they are. Just remember, son, we're in their home now. We have to respect it." And then suddenly, a low growl came through the trees, sending a jolt of fear through Daniel. He turned to his father, who had gone rigid, his expression shifting from relaxed to tense in an instant. "Did you hear that?" Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. Mark nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Stay close to me, Daniel." They turned back towards the campsite, but as they walked, the growl came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees. It was a sound that felt primal, ancient, and filled with malice. Daniel's heart raced as he glanced over his shoulder, the darkness seeming to thicken around him. "Dad, I'm scared," he admitted, clutching his father's hand. "I know, buddy. Let's just keep moving," Mark urged, his voice steady but strained. As they reached the clearing, the firelight flickered, casting long shadows that danced like phantoms. Mark grabbed a couple of logs and tossed them onto the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the air. "Let's just sit down and tell some stories," he suggested, trying to mask his own unease. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. The night dragged on. It was filled with stories and laughter, but the sense of dread lingered like a dark cloud. Eventually, exhaustion settled in, and Mark decided it was time to go to bed. "Let's get some sleep. We have a big day tomorrow," he said, pulling out their sleeping bags. Daniel crawled into his bag, but sleep eluded him. The sounds of the forest grew louder, the growls more frequent, as if the darkness was closing in around them. He could feel the weight of something watching, waiting for the right minute to strike. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yeah, buddy," Mark replied, his voice thick with sleep. "Can you stay awake just a little longer?" Mark sighed, shifting in a sleeping bag. "Yeah, just for a bit. What's on your mind, bud?" "I don't know, I just feel like there's something out there," Daniel admitted, his voice trembling. Mark propped himself up on one elbow, concern etched into his face. "Daniel, it's just your imagination. The forest can be a scary place, but we're safe here, I promise." But as the minutes ticked by, Daniel's unease grew. He could hear the growl again, closer this time, a deep rumble that sent chills throughout him. "Dad, I really think we should be going now," he said, his voice rising in panic. "I think I maybe just want to go home." Mark's expression hardened. "We're not going anywhere. It's the sound of the forest. You just need to trust me." Daniel wanted to argue, but the look in his father's eyes silenced him. He turned over, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around him, trying to block out the sounds of the night. But sleep was elusive, and the hours passed. The growls became more frequent, more insistent. Just before dawn, Daniel jolted awake to a blood-curdling scream that pierced the night. He shot up, his heart was racing, and he saw his father standing by the fire, flashlight in hand, his eyes wide with terror. "Daniel, get back!" Mark shouted, his voice filled with an urgency. Before Daniel could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, thin creature with elongated limbs and a mouth full of jagged teeth. A tall, emaciated creature with long limbs and a mouth full of jagged teeth. Its eyes glowed like embers in the darkness, fixated on Mark. "Dad?" Daniel screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the night. Mark took a step back, his flashlight flickering as he faced the creature. "Run, Daniel! Get to the car!" But Daniel couldn't move. He was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear as the creature lunged at his father. Mark swung the flashlight, but it was no use. The creature was upon him, its teeth sinking into his flesh with a sickening crunch. "No!" Daniel screamed, finally breaking free from his paralysis. He turned and ran, tears streaming down his face as he sprinted through the trees, branches clawing at him like the creature that had just taken his father. He could hear the growls behind him, the sound of something chasing him through the darkness. He didn't care to look back. All he could think about was getting to the car, getting away from the nightmare that had just unfolded before his very eyes. Daniel ran blindly, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically as he stumbled through the underbrush. The growls grew louder, closer, and he could feel the creature's breath on his neck. It was hot and rancid. Please, 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 he chanted underneath his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. And finally, he burst through into a clearing where the car was parked, the moonlight illuminating the scene like a spotlight. He fumbled with the keys, his hand shaking as he tried to unlock the door. And the growl echoed behind him, a low, menacing sound that sent a wave of terror crashing over him. He finally managed to get the door open and scrambled inside, slamming it shut just as the creature lunged at him. Daniel fumbled with the ignition, his fingers trembling as he turned the key. Suddenly, the engine roared to life, and he slammed the car into reverse, spinning the wheel to get away from the creature that was now clawing at the windows. He hit the gas, the tires spinning on the gravel as he tore away from the campsite, leaving the horror behind. The forest blurred past him, the trees becoming a dark, chaotic mass as he drove faster and faster, tears streaming down his face. As he drove, the reality of what happened began to sink in. His father was gone, taken by something that couldn't be explained. The weight of grief and fear settled heavily on his chest, suffocating him. Eventually, Daniel pulled over to the side of the road, his body shaking as he let the tears flow freely. He had just escaped, but at what cost? The memories of the night flooded back. His father's scream, the creature's teeth, the darkness that had swallowed them whole. The sun began to rise at the first light, breaking through the trees. The world felt different now, as if the darkness had seeped into everything, tainting the beauty of the morning. Eventually, a park ranger came down the park road and found Daniel trembling with fear, half comatose, with piss all over his pants. EMS was called and Daniel was hospitalized. When asked how he was driving his father's car, he said he worked on a farm and had to drive all the time. When asked about his father, Daniel fell silent. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel struggled to return to normalcy. The laughter of his friends felt distant and hollow, the warmth of his home a stark contrast to the cold grip of fear that had taken root into his heart. He would lay awake at night, haunted by the nightmares of the creature, the sounds of his father's screaming echoing in his mind. The forest had become a symbol of loss, a reminder of the darkness that could invade even the brightest of moments. One evening, as he sat on the porch overlooking the farm, he glanced toward the horizon where the trees met the sky, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. And for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw it. A tall, thin figure lurking at the edge of the forest, its eyes glowing in the fading light. The Adenamon. There are dark forces alive in Appalachia, a hotbed of terror and genocide. The region is known for its gorgeous mountain landscapes and insulated people. Its history, however, is quite bloody, and the residual energy remains to this day. I was stalked and hospitalized by a pre-Columbian Native American ghost in 2017. Now, I realize this may sound outrageous, but it's true, and I worry that shedding light on the situation may resume the terroristic happenings. I still find it necessary to expose this hidden threat to the world. To provide context to my story, my name is Jack and I'm from a small town in Kentucky called Ashland. Ashland is a humble town situated on the banks of the Ohio River and exists in a meager metropolitan area with neighboring cities in West Virginia and Ohio. As far as European settlement goes, Ashland was founded by the Pogue family in 1786 and remained an extended family ordeal for a few generations. During the settling of the area, The new habitants encountered a complex series of mounds scattered throughout. Upon excavation of these mounds, the settlers discovered their true origins. The mounds were burial grounds for an ancient civilization known as the Adena, who were dispersed among central Ohio, northern Kentucky, and West Virginia. What the excavators found was truly unbelievable. Skeletons with massive jaws, perfect teeth, and otherworldly heights. These were giants, with many skeletons reaching 7 feet and a few of them measuring at 8 feet, towering over their distant European counterparts. The giant ones were heralded as kings in the Adena culture. The culture would evolve into the Hopewell tradition, which itself would become the Fort Ancient culture. The people would fall victim to the smallpox epidemic of the 18th century, thus ending a 2,500-year tradition. But one could argue that their spirits stuck around and haunted the land in which they had resided, and in the name of civilization building, the European excavators plowed through most of these mounds, discarding their remains and artifacts. They quite literally flattened the area to build the city. In the process, they unlocked a whole world of metaphysical trauma. Ashland today has a general cloud of negativity hanging over it at all times. The metropolitan area was ranked the most miserable place in America last decade, and an opioid epidemic looms over the region. Ashland's neighbor, Huntington, was called the overdose capital of the world at one point. Cancer deaths are in abundance due to the city's manufacturing history, which thrived for a couple of decades before dwindling down into nothing. Good jobs are scarce, and the dream of every child is to escape to greener pastures. Ashland is even home of the parents of the famed serial killer, Charles Manson. In 2017, I took a trip to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, otherwise known as the home of the Mothman. Point Pleasant is about an hour away from Ashland, and it too has a general cloud of negativity hanging over it. It's a barren town, even smaller than Ashland. If arriving in Ashland felt like getting to a party after everyone has already left, then arriving in Point Pleasant must feel like getting to a funeral after everyone has already left. The buildings are decaying, the streets are empty, and smokestacks complete the skyline. After my return home, I had read about the idea that the Mothman was a myth created by a group of local journalists to revive a dying town and to put it on the horror map. I thought it was a brilliant idea, and one that could be replicated, but I had no connections in the local journalism industry and no platform of my own to spread the story. Then the light bulb blinked on one day. As an avid hobbyist photographer and a longtime fan of the YouTube series Marble Hornets, I decided to start a YouTube series about a fictional character known as the Adenamon. He was to be unusually tall, with generic Native American clothing and accessories. In retrospect, the concept was a bit problematic, but I was young and ambitious. I had it all planned out. I spent many hours researching the Adena and trying to get a better understanding of their culture, which has limited information available. I wrote outlines of the plot in my notebook and kept that notebook with me at all times. I had multiple episodes already planned out, some far into the series. I was researching how to build a character, like the Slender Man. I remember one day I went to Central Park in Ashland. Right beside an elementary school and a basketball court is a row of multiple ancient Adena burial mounds standing about 10 feet tall. As a child, I remember riding my bike over them, and after I grew up, they blocked off the bottom of the mound with an ineffective gate. One day in my pursuit to create the web series, I went to the mounds and meditated, writing down ideas in my notebook. The same day I went to a Catholic shrine nearby in Franklin Furnace, Ohio. I'd created a shoulder mount for my camera, and I went with my then-girlfriend to get some benign footage for the series. On each of the pillars in this shrine existed coins flipped in various orders. In order to create a compelling narrative, I flipped some of the coins on camera, hoping that it would develop into its own plot. I went home and laid down for bed. Now, I'm not usually a heavy dreamer, but I had a vivid dream that night. I found myself in a dense forest surrounded by towering trees. An eerie silence blanketed the area. As I navigated the forest, I heard a faint but haunting melody, carried along the whispers of the wind. I ventured deeper, and the trees parted. I fixated my eyes on the center of the forest, and I saw a massive Native American man towering over the trees. His eyes seemed to hold centuries' worth of wisdom, pain, and mischief. He held a flute made from a bone-like material, and he raised the instrument to his lips. As he played an otherworldly melody, the forest came alive, and shadows danced among the trees. I felt a strange pull towards it. I was drawn in by the haunting charm, and as the dream progressed, I grew uneasy. The tall man's intentions were unclear, and the melody grew aggressive and malevolent. The forest twisted, the trees creaked and groaned. I realized that I had stumbled upon a force older and more dangerous than I could comprehend. And just as quickly as the dream had manifested, it faded away. The next morning I woke up for work in extreme pain all throughout my body. My limbs felt like they were going to fall off. I had no energy and a splitting migraine. I'd never called off of work before, but I did that day. I went to urgent care and they sent me home. But when the pain persisted, I went to the emergency room. I was immediately given a spinal tap and tested for meningitis. The test came back negative, but what followed was a 10-day whirlwind of pain and emotions, pure blur, and a refusal of reality. I saw so many doctors, so many nurses, gave so much blood for 1,000,000 different tests, and had various full body scans, and generally considered my life over. I had accepted my fate. I was going to die in that hospital from whatever disease I had gotten. Now, to this day, I still don't know what I had. The doctors never actually figured it out. I made it out alive, but it threw a wrench into my plans. My depression intensified, and I never devoted any more time to the series. My life has been a general onslaught of bad luck since then. My mental state continued deteriorating, culminating in me punching a mirror one evening in a fit of unadulterated rage. The blood erupted from the veins on my wrist, and my then-girlfriend drove me to the hospital, where I was stitched up by the same doctor that performed my spinal tap just 7 months prior. I went on medication shortly afterwards, and life was normal for a while. A lot of things have happened in the past 6 years, and, well, I won't go into that, but things have gotten very dark for me. I've quit my job, reverted into an isolated hermit-like state, and have stopped taking my medication. I've fallen into a lot of rabbit holes, whether that's on this forum or on websites like YouTube. One of the most popular ideas is the law of attraction, which states that your thoughts dictate your reality. Now this, to me, is living proof of the law of attraction. I obsessed over this fictional character that I had created until it quite literally came back to life to get me, to shut my mouth about it. In some weird, metaphysical way, I think this makes sense. Time is only one of the dimensions that we live in, and who's to say that a spirit cannot move backwards in time? That is to say, my thoughts created a spirit that was able to travel backwards in time and cast its spell of negative energy to set forward the events that took place. The fact of the matter is that the Adenamon is real. I don't know what his purpose is. I don't know what his motives are. But I know that he is real, and he is born from a place of generational pain and trauma. While his people weren't the ones directly slaughtered by European settlers, his descendants were. And I believe that he carries this pain with him and seeks revenge on those who wronged his descendants. And that's why I believe that my region has been haunted. And that's why I believe that my life has been so traumatic. I'd all forgotten about the Adenamon as I moved on with my life. But the Adenamon didn't forget about me. I usually fall asleep watching creepy ghost stories on YouTube, and autoplay takes me in some weird directions. This morning I woke up to flute music and a general pain in the center of my head. The Adenamon is here. Alagash. Jason and his wife Meredith had been hunting nearly every day of the season so far, without luck. It was the last week before deer hunting closed for the year, and they were getting desperate. Jason decided they should try up north, in the Alagash. The spot they were going to, it was where his grandfather had taken him when he was a boy, the last time he had done what he called real hunting. Old timber company land. It had been clear-cut years or decades ago, and the forest had come back thick and tangled. The trees were stunted and compact, not one with a trunk bigger than its thigh, and not enough space between them for a man to take 2 clear steps in any direction. The deer bedded down there in the days when the hunters were prowling the fields, and you could run through a patch of woods, drive them out into the open, while the other hunter would post up on the edge of it, and he'd have his pick. It was a long drive though, an hour on the freeway, and another 90 minutes on the state highways. Desolate little roads that wound through the barren trees and the foothills, while the flat gray skies pissed down icy rain. When they'd gotten in the thick of it, the real dense woods where the night never really leaves the trees, Jason pulled off the little highway onto one of the crude dirt logging roads that cut an endless grid through the forest. He jumped from the cab with his rifle in one hand, called his wife over, sat her in the bed of the truck, and told her where the deer would be coming. She watched him walking down the road, a half a mile or more. Then he looked back at her, waved once, stepped over a ditch, and vanished into the trees. She waited, crouched in the truck bed, her finger on the trigger of her rifle as she scanned the clearing. A half an hour went by, then an hour. The woods were silent as ever. She was beginning to worry. When another 30 minutes had passed with no sign, she stood up in the truck bed and called his name. The woods ate up the noise, and then it was quiet. She called out again and again, louder each time. There was something coming into her voice now, the edge of frantic excitement that led into panic. She screamed until she felt her throat burn. She fired her rifle in the air 3 times, the universal distress signal. She listened until her ears hummed and throbbed with the silence. She picked up her rifle and sat in the cab, started it up, took it down the road to the spot she'd seen him step off from. She stood at the wood's edge, looked out into it, and saw the darkness and heard the muffled silence, and couldn't make herself go. She got back into the truck and drove off to find help. He'd walked quickly through the woods, picking his way through the trees, kicking and stomping as he went, making as much noise as he could manage. When he looked back and couldn't see the road anymore, he figured he was deep enough to start making his drive. he turned right towards Meredith in the truck and began crashing through the brush. It was a while before he suspected something was wrong. He'd been walking for what felt like hours, hadn't seen any deer, hadn't seen any signs of life as a matter of fact, and he figured he'd have gone at least as far as the truck by this point. He faced what he thought was the direction of the road. When he'd been walking earlier, he turned one way looking for a spot to cross a stream without getting his feet wet, turned the other way to avoid a particularly thick patch of undergrowth, always trying to correct himself so he stayed traveling in a reasonably straight line. He was confident that he kept going in the same direction, though he hadn't checked the angle of the sun earlier, so he couldn't confirm it. Either way, he should be pointing more or less towards the road now. He walked again for a few more hours. Now he was starting to get worried. He hadn't heard a sound outside of his own feet crashing through the saplings, and it was beginning to bother him. These woods were oppressive. It wasn't quite as cold as it had been when he first started off, but he was beginning to shiver every time he rested. He wanted to get into his truck and drive out of the woods and stop at a warm, dry restaurant full of noisy people, eat a big, hot, greasy hamburger with salty French fries that sizzled and crunched when he bit into them, and a thick milkshake he'd have to eat with a spoon. His hunger was like a knife point now, driving into his gut, and he desperately wished he had brought some food. He kept walking. The gloom under the trees was beginning to look a little darker, or so he imagined, and the thought panicked him. He picked up the pace. Now when he came to the streams, he didn't look for narrow spots to jump over or logs to balance on. He marched straight through them. The water was cold. It burnt his skin like it was boiling, and soon his feet went numb. He crashed through the brush. He tore his jacket. He cut his face and his hands on the thorns. He fired his rifle in threes, and when he heard nothing, he did it again. By the fourth volley, he was out of rounds. It was definitely getting darker now. The gloom was closing in tighter. He felt it constricting like a straitjacket, stifling him with the dead quiet and the endless forest. He wasn't even sure he was going anywhere. Everything looked the same, and for all he knew, it was the same. Dread of nightfall welled up in him and pressed against his throat. As he looked around him, the trees began to feel ominous in the dying light. Wherever he stood, they seemed to lean in over him, leering and thirsting for something. Dead sentinels, cold as the mud under his feet. It was very nearly dark. He was frantic, running as best he could, his clothes catching on the trees and tearing off, his breath clouding the air and steam rising off of him in the bitter night winds that were just beginning to sweep through the trees. He ran while the branches moaned and rocked, and his feet began to freeze. It was at this moment, when the panic threatened to overtake him, that he saw something that brought him relief. Far off through the woods, there were two circles of lights, headlights from a truck. When he saw them, he felt a warm comfort rising in his chest. It was going to get out, get back to his truck, leave the woods. He called out and waved his hands, and the headlights turned. Then he saw something that puzzled him. They were coming towards him, through the woods. And as they got closer, he noticed they seemed to be going between the trees. He was confused by this sight. It didn't seem to make any sense. They didn't move like a truck either. They turned, bobbed up and down, went over and around all the felled trees and stumps in the ground. And he suddenly realized they were much closer than he thought. Two perfect circles as big around as his fist. Somehow they weren't lighting up anything, though they glowed like molten steel. He was feeling very strange then, the beginnings of real fear, when he caught an odor, the smell of must and decay. Old rot. They seemed to glide to him impossibly fast, and he could see now something long, thin, and emaciated, the points of bones straining against dry, dead skin. It inhaled with sharp, raspy little gasps, and breathed out in long, shuddering waves, almost like it was crying. When it landed atop him, he could hear it, over the sound of skin tearing like rending fabric, bones that crackled and split, and a ringing in his ears. It was sobbing pitifully. Even through the fistfuls of flesh, those long hands were shoveling, one after another, into its mouth. Meredith sighed. It had been 2 weeks and there was no sign of him. Not a trace. Just as though the world had opened up and swallowed him whole. Today would be the last day of the search. The winter snows had come, and even she had to admit the hope of him emerging from those woods had long since died. She vowed to keep looking, though, right up until the last moment. Now here she is, on the cusp of nightfall, the other searchers gone already, and not a single thread of his clothes. A footprint in the snow, a rock cairn to show that he had ever been there. She gave one last look around the clearing as she climbed into the cab of the truck, started it up, and flipped on the lights. As she turned to her left to put on her seatbelt, she was struck by the sight of a pair of headlights coming quickly towards her. And for a brief moment, she was ecstatic with hope. Maybe it was one of the searchers. Maybe they'd found Jason after all, and they were rushing to tell her now. Maybe. But this thought was interrupted by another, one of confusion. The road was in front of her. Where were those headlights coming from? Terror on the cliff. Well, I'm telling you, it happened, and I don't give a damn if you believe me or not. Hell, I wouldn't believe it too, if I didn't see it with my very own eyes. Well, you want to hear the story, the truth, just how it happened. Well, I could tell you, but as I said, you ain't gonna believe it. This particular event occurred a year ago today, right up there on that mountain. It was high noon and me and my brother Johnny Boy were hunting deer. Now as you can see, that there mountain is full of cliffs, very dangerous. Gotta be a pro to make your way up there. Had an uncle fell clean off that face and smashed his head right open just like a crackin' watermelon. Anyway, so as we was making our way up the creek slowly as to not disturb the deer. They's a smart little buggers they is. But we was smarter. We walked with our shoes off as to not make any waves. Slowly, and oh so slowly, we crept up the creek, around the giant bend and settled in just below that giant oak. I think you know the one. We were prepared to wait it out. Well, we brought ourselves some jerky and some milk right off my goat Matilda's titty. Now after a couple hours, we decided it was time to move. It was reaching late afternoon and we got the itching. Mama was expecting us home by sundown, and by damn, she was expecting to be cooking up some meat tonight. But I tell you what, Mama didn't like when we showed up empty-handed. My poor ass was still sore from the last time we didn't get a buck. I looked at Johnny Boy and, well, he looked at me. We started our way up the bottom of the cliff. Now that there bottom wasn't all that bad on account of those footpaths that those Injuns had made way back when, but it was still slippery. And when we got up to about 50 feet, we came across a flat space. It went a ways back and then it spread out on the sides. I hear a tale about how them Indians used to go up there and do some fancy dancing and such. They left crap all over up there. Even some of those large poles with pictures cut right into the bark. I drew my own on one of them. It was of my twig and berries. You know, my cock and balls. Best picture I ever drew. Well, all my friends said that anyway. But some days you could find deer right there on that very patch. But not on this day. No sir, no such luck. We was going to have to work for this one. This trail continued up at the back of that there patch, and this was the hardest part. No engine paths no more, no sir. This was real man's climbing. 100 feet straight up the face with just some cracks to put your hands in. John Boy went first, and well, I followed behind him. And every so slowly he climbed, step by step and hand by hand. In a lightning flash, John Boy lost grip with his left hand. He let out a grunt. You see, John Boy was stuck stupid on account of almost dying as a baby. He never really could say a word. Being a cleaver, though, he began to grunting to let it known what he wanted or needed. He got along pretty damn well, too. Anyway, so John Boy let out a loud grunt as his darn hand slipped off that damn rock. But just as the master he was, he stayed a hell of a calm and placed his hand back into the hold. I whispered, "Damn, John Boy, gave me might of a scare on that one." He gave a sheepish grin and continued up on that path. Just as he reached the top, though, he stopped. Now, John Boy might have been a little bit dumb, but he was strong as an ox. And what happened next, well, I will never forget. I started to feel a trickle, like a stream on my face. I took a quick glance around, but there were no clouds. I couldn't imagine what the hell it was. And as it entered my mouth, well, I knew exactly what it was. John Boy, the strangest and bravest I knew, was pissing himself. Now, suddenly I couldn't move. I realized that if John Boy was pissing himself, he must have been seeing something that no one could see and still hold their liquid. A new terror entered my mind. Drinking piss was the least of my worries. Getting wet on this cliff wall was almost certainly going to be my death. And just as I started to shake and open my mouth to speak, whoosh, just like that, John Boy was taken. I mean, he was lifted and pulled so fast, both of his shoes came off and damn near hit me in the noggin on the way down. I wanted to scream for my brother, but I knew I couldn't. I was a sitting duck. And after a moment of silence, I saw a giant shadow appear above me. Whatever it was, that thing was large. And within seconds I heard what sounded like dynamite exploding in small charges on the ground above. And all of a sudden, with a giant thud, bam, John Boy's lifeless body was hanging just enough over the edge of the cliff for me to see his eyes staring me in the face, almost as if he was saying his final goodbye. With one giant motion, his body was lifted again and thrown out over the cliff into the forest below. He wasn't just thrown, though. He went a good quarter mile. And as tears welled up in my eye for the loss of my brother and my own impending doom, whatever it was, the forest became quiet again. But still not being able to move, I held on for dear life. Now, after a few minutes, I realized I had to try. Slowly, and while still shaking terribly, I made my way back down the cliff, and as I reached the patch, I fell to that darn ground like a lump. When I opened my eyes again, it was dark, and I was aching all over. I started to wonder to myself if it had been some kind of dream, but then when I noticed John Boy was nowhere to be found, I knew it wasn't. It was all too real. Now, after gathering myself for a couple of minutes, I went and took a piss behind a tree and I started down the 50-foot path. But all I could think about was what that thing was and where the hell was John Boy. As I finally reached the porch of the house, I yelled out,
Mama? Johnny boy? John boy? Mama, all 450 pounds of her, came running out of the house like it was on fire. Where's John boy, Henry? Where is John boy? I yelled. He's gone, Mama. The devil got him. She then helped me up and we went into the table. I told Mama all that had happened that day. I'm not sure she believed me. Hell, I wasn't sure if I believed me. But it happened just like I said, and that's that. Now, they sent out a search party the next day to find John boy. He was nowhere to be found. They searched and searched for weeks. And finally, about 3 months later, a hunter had made his way into the top of a tree to lay in wait for an elk when he spotted something dangling from the top of a tree. As he got closer, well, he could see John boy's red jacket and blue jeans. Now that darn tree, hell, that was so high, they had to bring in one of those police helicopters to remove his body. In fact, the event became almost an event for the whole town. They had a town picnic and parade and everything. Like my brother's death was a celebration. But old John boy, well, he got the last laugh. When they picked up his body, his bones were so busted up that he just felt like a leaf in the wind and landed right on the mayor's wife's lap. Well, she let out a horrendous scream and went running off into the forest with her asshole husband following behind. Well, John boy hated the mayor because he always made fun of him. And I thought, you know what? Good for you, John boy. You got the last laugh. Now, we had a proper burial for John boy after the feds were done looking over his body. People say it kind of brought our little town a little closer together, but I think it's BS, but whatever. I go pay my respects every now and then, but every time I do, I think of that day and what happened to poor Johnny boy. I also wonder, what the hell was that thing? And where is it now?